Hey, welcome back to Sleepy Old World. If you are new here, I am so glad you found your way to this corner of the internet. Pull up something soft, maybe a blanket, maybe that pillow you have been meaning to wash for 3 weeks and just haven't gotten round to. Get yourself horizontal if you can. And if you have been here before, honestly, thank you. Knowing that you come back matters more than I can easily say. Tonight we are going somewhere that might surprise you, because the title of what we are doing here sounds like it belongs in a glossy magazine. Weight loss secrets. But I promise you, that is not what this actually is. Not really. The moment you step inside the world we are about to enter, you will realize quickly that what those women of the 1950s were doing with their bodies, their food, their kitchens, their daily rhythms, was something far more interesting and far more human than any magazine headline could contain. Before we begin, if tonight feels like the right kind of company, if this voice and these stories feel like somewhere you want to return, would you take just a quiet second and subscribe? Leave a like if the mood finds you. And if you are watching this at some strange hour in some quiet corner of your world, I would genuinely love to know where you are. Drop a comment. I read them. Now, dim the lights if you can. Let the room go soft. Pull whatever you are wrapped in just a little closer. And let us go back, all the way back to a world of pedal pushers and casserole dishes and kitchen scales on the counter, and women who moved through their days in ways that the modern world has almost entirely forgotten. It is 1957, and I want you to picture not a celebrity, not a movie star, not the airbrushed woman from the magazine cover. I want you to picture your grandmother, or your great-grandmother, or the woman who lived 2 houses down on whatever street she lived on, with the hydrangeas by the mailbox and the smell of something baking that always drifted out when the windows were open in summer. She is not thinking about weight loss the way you think about it. She does not have an app on her phone tracking her macros. She has never heard the word macros. She does not have a gym membership, not the kind you pay for every month and use twice. She does not own a set of dumbbells. She probably does not own a bathroom scale, or if she does, she uses it maybe once a week and does not particularly obsess over the number. And yet, she is, by most measurements we would apply today, in far better physical condition than the average person sitting on a couch in the 21st century. She walks more, eats differently, sleeps with more regularity, spends her energy in ways that are spread across the whole day rather than bunched into an hour at the gym and then 8 hours sitting still. She has a relationship with food that is complicated and worth understanding, not because it was perfect, because it absolutely was not, but because it contains things we have genuinely lost and might benefit from finding again. This is that story. And the way I want to tell it is not as a list of tips. You have enough lists. What I want to do is take you inside her day, inside her kitchen, her pantry, her grocery habits, her relationship with her own body, the social pressures she navigated, the quiet wisdom she carried without calling it wisdom, the things she did simply because it was Tuesday, and that was how Tuesday was done. Stay with me. The coffee is on. The morning is just beginning. She woke up early. This is where we should start, because it is where everything else begins to make sense. Not with food, not with exercise, not with any particular philosophy. With the simple biological reality that she almost never slept past 7 in the morning, and more often she was up before 6, and on the days when something needed to be done before the household woke up, which was most days, it was 5:30. The alarm clock on her nightstand was not a gentle sound. It was not a simulated sunrise. It did not play birdsong or soft piano music that gradually increased in volume. It was a bell, a real mechanical bell, that worked because a small hammer struck a piece of metal, repeatedly, until someone reached over and stopped it. You did not lie there contemplating whether to get up. The decision was made for you by the sheer unpleasantness of the sound continuing. She got up. And here is the first thing that almost no one talks about when they talk about 1950s health, which is that the simple act of waking early and beginning to move almost immediately is one of the most powerful metabolic regulators a human body has. We know this now, with decades of chronobiology research to back it up. She knew it in the way you know things that your body has been doing forever, not as a fact, just as the shape of mornings. She did not eat immediately. This is worth noting. In a great many households in the 1950s, there was a period after waking, sometimes 30 minutes, sometimes an hour, during which the woman of the house was already fully engaged in the work of the morning before she sat down to eat anything. She had lit the stove, or checked whether it was already going. She had put the coffee on. She had perhaps started a load of laundry in the wringer washer that took considerably more physical involvement than simply pressing a button. She had made a judgment about what needed to happen before her husband came downstairs, and she had started happening it. This was not conscious intermittent fasting. The concept did not exist in her vocabulary, but it was, functionally, a version of something we now understand to be metabolically useful, a period of morning movement before the first meal, a window during which the body was working on its overnight reserves before new fuel was introduced. She moved through her kitchen. I want you to actually picture this, because the physical geography of a 1950s kitchen was a very different thing from what most of us navigate now. Even in a modest house, the kitchen required constant movement to function. The refrigerator was in one corner, the stove was along another wall, the sink was under the window, the pantry, if she had one, was down a short step or around a corner, a small room lined with shelves where canned goods and dry staples lived in careful rows. The counter space was limited by our standards. Things did not live conveniently at hand. You moved to get them. A single breakfast, prepared from scratch on a Tuesday morning, might involve 15 distinct physical movements between appliances and counters and shelves. Getting the eggs from the refrigerator, getting the skillet from the cabinet below the stove, getting the bread from the bread box on the counter, getting the butter dish, getting the plates from the cabinet above the sink, walking to the table to set them, walking back, cracking the eggs at the counter, carrying the plates with food to the table. This is not exercise. Nobody called it exercise, but it was movement, constant, purposeful movement, woven into the texture of the morning in a way that added up. Studies done in the decades since have looked at this phenomenon under the label of non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which means essentially the calories your body uses not during formal exercise, but during all the small physical demands of ordinary life. The housewife of the 1950s had extraordinarily high non-exercise activity thermogenesis by modern standards. She was not burning those calories in a gym. She was burning them making breakfast, carrying laundry, hanging sheets on the line, walking to the corner store, sweeping floors on her hands and knees with a brush. The coffee was ready, and here is where I want to slow down for a moment, because the coffee itself tells us something. She drank it black, or with a small amount of cream, or occasionally with a single teaspoon of sugar. Not because she was being disciplined about calories, not because she had read anything telling her to be careful about sweetened beverages, because that was how coffee was. The elaborate coffeehouse drinks we take for granted now, the ones that contain 400 calories and an inch of whipped cream, did not exist as a category of morning consumption. Coffee was coffee. It came in a cup, and it was dark, and it was hot, and it helped her wake up. The same simplicity extended to almost everything she drank. Water from the tap when she was thirsty, milk at meals, particularly at dinner, sometimes at breakfast. Juice, occasionally. Usually orange juice. Usually a small glass, 4 ounces perhaps, because juice was made from actual fruit that had to be squeezed by hand or bought in a small can that was mixed with water, and the effort involved meant you did not pour yourself a large glass casually. Tea in the afternoon if that was her habit, and that was generally the complete list. No sugared sodas with breakfast, no flavored drinks, no smoothies, no meal replacement shakes, no protein powder mixed into anything. Liquid calories were not something she thought about carefully. She just did not consume very many of them, because the culture around her had not yet invented most of the vehicles for consuming them. This seems like a small thing. It is not a small thing. When researchers look at where excess calories come from in modern diets, liquid calories, the things we drink without thinking because they do not feel like food, account for an enormous portion of the gap between what people ate in the 1950s and what people eat now. She had essentially closed that gap without thinking about it, simply by living in a time before the gap had been opened. Breakfast itself. Now, the 1950s breakfast has a reputation, and the reputation is not entirely wrong, but it is not the whole picture either. Yes, eggs. Yes, bacon or sausage on the weekends. Yes, toast with butter. Yes, sometimes pancakes. But there is something important about the way these foods were consumed that gets lost in the telling. The portions were smaller, not because she was counting anything, because the dish she served them on was smaller. The plate in a 1950s household was typically 9 inches in diameter. The plate in a modern household is typically 11 or 12 inches in diameter. That sounds trivial. It is not trivial. Research on portion size has established pretty clearly that humans tend to fill their plates and then eat what is on them. And when the plate is larger, more goes on it, and more gets eaten, without any conscious awareness that the quantity has changed. She served eggs, but she served 2 eggs, not a 4-egg scramble. She served 2 strips of bacon, not 6. She put 1 piece of toast on the plate, not 3. And that was a normal breakfast, not a diet breakfast, not a carefully measured breakfast. Just breakfast, calibrated by the size of the serving vessels and by a general culture of sufficiency rather than abundance. There was no second helping at breakfast, generally. The food was made, the food was served, the food was eaten, and then the morning continued. There was no additional foraging through the kitchen afterward looking for something else, because the kitchen was a place where work happened and where food was made and served at designated times. It was not a space you wandered through grazing. The physical and social organization of the house discouraged casual snacking in a way that our wide-open, food-everywhere modern kitchens simply do not. After breakfast, the dishes. This is one of those things that sounds completely unrelated to anything metabolic, and yet sits at the heart of what made her daily life physically different from ours. She washed the breakfast dishes by hand. Not immediately always. Sometimes they soaked while she did something else first. But, within an hour, she was standing at the sink with hot water and dish soap, washing each item individually, rinsing it, and placing it in the drying rack, or drying it with a dish towel, and putting it away. This took perhaps 15 to 20 minutes for a household of 4. Every single morning, every meal produced a variation of this task. Breakfast dishes, lunch dishes, dinner dishes, the pot from cooking, the serving bowl, the utensils, all of it washed by hand. In a year, the time spent washing dishes in a 1950s household added up to something like 150 hours. 150 hours of standing, reaching, rinsing, movement that was essentially invisible because nobody counted it as anything. It was just the dishes. The dishwasher was available in the 1950s to households that could afford one, though it was still relatively uncommon in working and middle-class homes for much of the decade. But even when she eventually got one, she often still did a certain amount of hand washing, because the dishwasher was for good days or for when company had been over, and the idea of loading the machine for 2 cups and a skillet felt faintly wasteful. So her hands stayed in the hot water, and her body stayed standing. Then she cleaned. The daily cleaning of a 1950s household is worth spending real time with, because I think it is one of the most underestimated physical activities in the history of domestic life. Not because it was glamorous, or because the women who did it were treated with appropriate respect for the labor it represented. They were not, and that is a different and important conversation, but purely from the perspective of what the body does during housework, the demands were extraordinary. Monday was laundry. The wringer washer, if she had one, required her to feed wet clothing through 2 rotating rollers by hand to press out the water before the clothes went on the line. If she did not have a wringer washer, she was using a wash tub and a washboard, which required even more physical effort. Hanging laundry on an outdoor line meant carrying heavy wet baskets out of the house, lifting each item, reaching up to clip it, bending for the next item, again and again until the basket was empty. In winter, this was done in the cold. In summer, it was done in the heat. On rainy days, the laundry was hung inside on racks that she had to arrange and then fold everything from later. Tuesday was ironing, often. The iron itself was heavier than modern irons. It required standing at an ironing board for an hour or more, lifting and pressing and repositioning. Cotton wrinkled badly. Everything was cotton. You ironed shirts. You ironed pillowcases. You ironed kitchen towels. You ironed your husband's handkerchiefs, which required a kind of focused, small-scale precision work that kept the shoulders and arms engaged continuously. Wednesday might be floors, getting down on hands and knees to scrub the kitchen floor with a brush and a bucket of hot water and Murphy oil soap. Moving furniture to sweep under it. The vacuum cleaner existed, yes, but it was heavy and unwieldy by modern standards, and it required pushing and pulling across every room with enough force that you genuinely felt it in your arms by the time you were done. Thursday might be the bathroom, the windows, the dusting of every horizontal surface in every room. Not a quick wipe with a disposable cloth. Actual dusting with a cloth that had to be shaken out the back door. Actual window washing with vinegar water and newspaper. Actual scrubbing of the toilet and the sink and the bathtub. And through all of it, through the entire week of this physical labor, she was burning calories that she never counted, never logged, never thought of as exercise, because it was not exercise. It was Tuesday. It was what Tuesday was. Now I want to say something honest here, because I think honesty is what makes this history actually useful rather than just nostalgic. She did not love all of this. Most women of the 1950s did not love the labor of housekeeping the way it was romanticized in the magazines. The magazine version showed a woman in a crisp dress, smiling over her gleaming floor, as though the floor had somehow cleaned itself through the force of her cheerful nature. The reality was tired backs and chapped hands, and the quiet frustration of doing work that would need to be done again in exactly the same way next week. We should not romanticize the labor itself, but we can notice what it did to the body without romanticizing it. We can notice that a woman who moved this much through her ordinary days was maintaining a baseline level of physical activity that no gym membership was required to achieve. Let us talk about walking. The average American adult today walks somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 steps a day. The recommendations for basic health are 10,000. The housewife of the 1950s, researchers who have tried to reconstruct historical activity levels estimate, was likely walking something closer to 8 or 10,000 steps simply in the course of her daily domestic work, plus the walking she did outside the house, which was considerably more than the average person does today. She walked to the grocery store, often, or at minimum walked from the far end of the parking lot, because parking lots were smaller and grocery stores were smaller, and the culture had not yet designed the assumption of the car into every transaction. She walked to the church hall for the meeting on Wednesday afternoon. She walked the children to school. She walked to her neighbor's house rather than calling her on the phone, because calling on the phone felt slightly formal and walking over felt natural. The neighborhood itself was structured for walking in a way that many modern neighborhoods are not. Stores were within walking distance of houses because that was how towns were built before the car reorganized everything around the assumption of driving. The scale of daily life assumed a human body moving through space on foot as the primary mode of transportation for anything within a reasonable radius. She did not think of this as exercise. She thought of it as going to the store. She thought of it as taking the children to school. She thought of it as visiting Eleanor down the road, which needed to happen because Eleanor had been a little under the weather and someone should check. The accumulation of this walking, added to the housework, added to the physical demands of cooking from scratch, added to the activity of a life that had not yet been optimized for sitting still, produced a body that was simply more active, day in and day out, than the average modern body. And then there was the garden. Not every woman had a garden, but an enormous number of women in the 1950s did, particularly outside the densest urban centers. A kitchen garden, even a small one, along the fence or behind the garage, where she grew tomatoes and beans and cucumbers and maybe some herbs and a row of marigolds that kept the insects off. Where she spent time in summer bending and kneeling and pulling and carrying in a way that engaged the whole body in ways that sit-down exercise does not. The physical posture of gardening specifically, the kneeling and crouching and reaching, uses muscles in the lower body and core that sitting at a desk literally shortens and weakens. The woman who spent an hour in her garden on a Tuesday afternoon in June was doing something for her body that no amount of sitting on a stationary bike would have fully replicated, not because the bike is bad, but because the specific demands of gardening, the varied angles, the low positions, the carrying of full watering cans, the raking, are genuinely different. And then she canned what grew. The canning season in late summer was a major domestic event, a period of intense physical work that lasted weeks. Washing jars, lifting heavy pots of boiling water, carrying flat after flat of produce from garden to kitchen, standing at the stove in August heat stirring jam or tomato sauce. By the time September arrived, and the shelves in the pantry were lined with her summer's work, she had spent the equivalent of many full workdays in intense, sustained physical activity. Let us shift now from how she moved to what she ate, because this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating and where I think the distance between 1957 and now is most revealing. She cooked. Not in the lifestyle magazine sense where cooking means you assembled a charcuterie board and drizzled olive oil on some bread. She cooked from raw ingredients, nearly every day, for nearly every meal. She knew how to break down a chicken. She knew how to make soup from bones. She knew what to do with a pound of dried beans and a ham hock and 2 hours of time. She knew how to make pastry crust from scratch, which means she knew the exact feel of the dough when it had enough fat worked into it, and not too much, a kind of knowledge that lives in the hands rather than in any recipe. This relationship with food as raw material was one of the most powerful regulators of her consumption that she never recognized as such. When you make food from scratch, you know exactly what went into it. Not in the anxious, label-reading way we know things about processed food now, but in a direct, physical, experienced way. She had mixed the cake batter herself. She had measured the sugar that went into it. She had eaten a slice of that cake at a birthday party or a church social, and then that was the cake, finished, no more until the next occasion that called for one. Cake was not something that existed perpetually in her life, available in individually wrapped portions any time a craving arose. Cake was something she made when there was a reason to make it, and making it required time and intention, and the gathering of specific ingredients, and the actual physical work of making it. The friction involved in accessing cake was high, and high friction is one of the most powerful appetite regulators that exists. This principle extended across almost everything she ate. the cookies that required creaming butter and sugar by hand with a wooden spoon because she might not have an electric mixer or might not feel like getting it out of the cabinet and washing it afterward, the pie that required making the crust, preparing the filling, waiting for it to bake, waiting for it to cool, the bread that required 2 rising periods and most of an afternoon. These were not diet foods. They were ordinary, completely non-disciplined foods, but the process of getting to them built in a natural pause, a natural limit, that refrigerated sections full of pre-made things simply do not have. She understood frugality, and this is a value that I want to spend real time with, because I think it has been almost completely erased from the modern relationship with food, and its absence matters more than most of us recognize. She did not throw food away, not because she was particularly virtuous, but because food cost a meaningful percentage of the household budget, and the household budget was a real constraint, not an abstraction. Leftovers were not something that lived in the refrigerator for 3 days before being thrown out with mild guilt. Leftovers were Monday's dinner reconstituted into something slightly different. The chicken carcass from Sunday's roast was boiled Monday morning for stock. The stock became Tuesday's vegetable soup. The heel of bread that had gone slightly stale was cut into cubes and dried in the oven for croutons or breadcrumbs. Nothing organic left the house until it had been used to its last useful form. This practice had significant metabolic consequences, though she would never have described it that way. It meant that the food she bought and prepared was eaten in measured, purposeful quantities, spread across multiple meals. She was not cooking a large pot of pasta and eating most of it in one sitting, because it was there and she was still watching television. She was cooking enough for the meal, with perhaps a planned excess that would become something else the next day. The quantities she cooked were calibrated to feed the people who needed to be fed, not to produce maximum convenience or to fill the largest available vessel. Recipes of the era reflect this. The 1950s casserole serves 6, meaning it genuinely serves 6 people 1 portion each, not 2 people who eat 3 portions each because the pan is full and the television is on and nobody is paying attention. Portion size came up earlier in our conversation about breakfast plates, and I want to return to it now more broadly because it is such a significant piece of this story. The serving dishes she used were smaller than what we use now. The glasses were smaller, the bowls were smaller. A serving of meat at dinner was 3 or 4 ounces, not the 8-ounce default of the modern restaurant plate that has recalibrated everyone's perception of what a serving is. This was not discipline, it was not restraint. It was simply the size of the dish, combined with a food culture that had not yet been influenced by the supersizing logic that would begin entering American food culture in the 1960s and accelerate dramatically through the decades that followed. When you do not have more, you eat what there is, when what there is genuinely proportioned to what a human body needs, rather than what a marketing department has decided will make you feel you got good value. The body does something quite simple and rather beautiful. It eats what it needs, and then it stops, because the meal is done and the food is gone, and nobody is suggesting you have more. Now let us talk about the structure of her eating day, because the structure itself was a metabolic regulator she never thought about consciously. She ate 3 meals at roughly predictable times. Breakfast somewhere between 6 and 8 in the morning, lunch sometime around noon or 1 in the afternoon, dinner between 5:30 and 6:30 in the evening, and then, with occasional exceptions, she was done eating until the next morning. Not because she was following any eating protocol, because that was when meals happened. Eating between meals was something you did not do as an adult, or if you did, it was a small, specific thing. An apple, a few crackers, a cup of tea with a ginger snap. Not a bag of chips and a handful of cookies and a leftover slice of whatever was in the refrigerator. The culture around snacking was entirely different in the 1950s. Snacking as a concept, as a commercial category, as something the food industry had identified as a distinct revenue stream and invested heavily in making as easy and appealing and frictionless as possible, was in its infancy. The snack foods that existed were modest and limited: crackers, nuts, fruit, the occasional cookie from the tin. There was no aisle at the grocery store devoted entirely to individually packaged snacks in 47 flavors. There was no pantry staple that had been engineered by food scientists to hit the exact combination of salt, fat, and sugar that creates the sensation of craving more, even as you're eating. She ate her 3 meals, and then she was done, and her body had long fasting windows between those meals, not because she was intermittent fasting, because that was the shape of the day. The research on eating frequency and metabolic health is genuinely complex, and I do not want to oversimplify it. But there is consistent evidence that long periods without eating, particularly the overnight fast extended by not eating late in the evening, give the body time to do metabolic maintenance work that it cannot do when it is constantly processing new food. She gave her body that time every day without thinking about it, because there was simply nothing to eat at 10 o'clock at night, except what she would have had to go to the kitchen and make herself, and she was tired, and bed was calling, and the kitchen was clean, and she was not going to dirty it again. Vegetables were different. I want to linger here because I think this is one of the most underappreciated differences between her plate and ours. Not just the quantity of vegetables she ate, but their character, their density, their relationship to water and fiber, and the fundamental biology of satiety. She grew some of what she ate when she had the garden. She bought the rest at the produce market or the grocery store vegetable section, and she bought what was in season because what was in season was what was available, and available meant fresh, and fresh was the only option that existed before everything became available everywhere, all the time. Seasonal eating, which has become a slightly precious thing that some people practice intentionally now as a kind of conscious food philosophy, was simply how food worked in the 1950s. In winter, you had root vegetables, potatoes and carrots and turnips and parsnips, and cabbage that kept well in the cold, and canned tomatoes from summer, and dried beans that had been stored since the fall. In spring, the first peas and lettuces arrived, and they were genuinely exciting because they were the first fresh greens in months. In summer, the garden and the produce stands were full. In fall, the abundance was preserved and put away. This seasonal rhythm meant that she was eating vegetables that were genuinely at peak ripeness, genuinely dense with nutrients, genuinely flavorful in their own right, because they had been grown in their right season in soil that had not been exhausted by year-round production. A tomato she ate in August from her own garden or from the farm stand down the road was a fundamentally different object from a tomato that had been grown in a hothouse in winter and trucked across the country and sat on a shelf for a week. The taste was different, the water content was different. The satisfaction of eating it was different. She ate her vegetables cooked, often. The boiled or steamed or roasted vegetable was the default. And while we now know that some vegetables are nutritionally better eaten raw, there is a metabolic argument for cooked vegetables that is less often discussed. Cooked vegetables are more satiating per calorie. The softening of the plant cell walls during cooking releases more of the actual food energy, meaning you feel fuller from a smaller volume. The woman who ate a bowl of boiled carrots and green beans alongside her pork chop was feeding her satiety mechanisms more efficiently than she might have realized, and she ate fiber, an enormous, robust, almost startling amount of dietary fiber by modern standards, because the whole grains and legumes and root vegetables and leafy greens that formed the bulk of her diet were fiber-dense in ways that the processed and refined foods that gradually replaced them in the American diet were not. Fiber is not a nutrient in the traditional sense because it does not provide energy, but it is one of the most powerful appetite regulators we know of. It slows the movement of food through the digestive system, keeping you feeling full for longer. It feeds the gut bacteria that influence everything from mood to metabolism. It prevents the blood sugar spikes and crashes that drive hunger and cravings. She was eating roughly twice the fiber the average American eats today, without trying, without supplementing, without buying anything at a health food store, just through the ordinary food of ordinary meals. The bread she ate was different. This is worth its own moment because bread was such a central daily food. She baked it, many women, or bought it from a local bakery or a small grocery. The bread was dense, close-grained, made with ingredients that were few and real. Flour, water, salt, yeast, sometimes a small amount of fat or sugar. The flour might be white flour, or it might be a mix of white and whole wheat, but either way it was flour that had not been stripped down to its most refined and nutrient-poor form in the industrial way that bread production would eventually become. The white bread that became a symbol of American home baking in this era was not the soft, shelf-stable 20-ingredient industrial product that dominates grocery store shelves today. It was bread. It went stale in a day or two, which is what bread does. It was made in a loaf that sliced into pieces of modest thickness, because she was cutting it by hand with a bread knife, and cutting thick slices took effort and produced fewer slices from the loaf. A slice of her homemade bread was structurally and metabolically quite different from a slice of modern commercial bread, even though both are white bread. The glycemic impact, the way it hit her blood sugar, was different. The satiety response was different. The fact that it went stale and was therefore not infinitely available created natural limits on consumption. She ate at a table, not in front of the television, not standing at the kitchen counter, not in the car. At a table, seated, with other people, at a designated time, with a plate and silverware and a glass of something. The ritual of the meal was preserved intact in the 1950s household in a way that has eroded significantly since. This matters for reasons that go well beyond mere etiquette. Research on eating behavior consistently shows that people eat more when they eat in front of a screen than when they eat away from one. They eat more when they eat while standing. They eat more when the eating is not a distinct bounded activity, but rather something happening alongside something else. The psychology of the meal, the clear beginning and end, the social dimension of eating with others, the simple act of sitting down and being present for the eating itself, all of these things influence how much you eat and how satisfied you feel afterward. She sat at the table, she ate her meal, she noticed that she was eating, and then, when the meal was done, it was done. There is something in this that sounds almost absurdly simple, and yet represents one of the most significant shifts in American eating culture over the past 70 years. We eat everywhere now. We eat all the time. We eat while working, while driving, while watching, while doing something else. The meal has fragmented from a distinct, bounded, communal event into a background behavior that happens continuously throughout the day, and the body does not handle background continuous eating the same way it handles three distinct bounded meals. Now I want to talk about sugar, not in the alarming way, not as a villain, but historically, because the relationship between the 1950s woman and sugar was genuinely different from ours, and understanding how is more illuminating than any sensationalized claim about sugar's evils. She used sugar. She kept it in the canister, next to the flour in the coffee. She put it in her coffee, 1 teaspoon perhaps. She baked with it, liberally, in cakes and cookies and pies. She put a spoonful in the berry jam she made in summer to help it set. She made sweet things, and she ate sweet things. But the sugar she consumed was mostly in things she had made herself, and making sweet things from scratch is, as we have established, a naturally limiting process. You make a pie, you serve it at Sunday dinner, you have a piece, it is gone in a few days. You do not make another one until there is occasion for another one. The hidden sugars that now pervade nearly everything in the modern grocery store, the sugar in bread and salad dressing and soup and pasta sauce and yogurt, and almost everything that comes in a package, did not exist in her pantry because she was not buying most things in packages. She was buying ingredients and making food from them. The ingredient list for her Tuesday dinner was short and known: a cut of meat, some potatoes, some vegetables, butter, salt, perhaps some herbs. There was no hidden sugar in any of it. The total daily sugar intake of the average American has more than doubled since the 1950s, and the vast majority of the increase comes not from people deciding to eat more cake, but from the sugar that has been added to processed foods as a flavoring and preservative and texture agent. Sugar makes things taste good. Sugar makes things shelf-stable. Sugar is cheap. The food industry discovered all of this in the decades following the 1950s and acted on it comprehensively. She was not navigating that landscape because it had not been built yet. Let us talk about fat, because the story of fat in the 1950s is interesting and a little surprising. She did not eat a low-fat diet. That idea did not exist for her. She ate butter, real butter, on her bread and in her cooking. She cooked the bacon in the morning and then used the leftover fat in the pan to cook the eggs, because this was simply practical and it tasted good. She made pie crust with lard, which is rendered pork fat, and it produced the most tender, flavorful pastry crust you can make, as anyone who has eaten pie made with lard versus pie made with the modern substitutes will tell you with considerable passion. The dietary fat she ate was largely naturally occurring fat from animals she cooked, and from dairy products, and from the small amounts of olive oil or vegetable oil she used for certain preparations. It was not abundant in her diet, not because she was avoiding it, but because the quantities of food she ate overall were moderate, and the fat was proportional to those quantities. What she was not eating, because it had not yet been invented or mass-distributed, was the industrial trans fats that appeared in increasing quantities in processed foods from the 1950s onward, as the food industry learnt to harden liquid vegetable oils into shelf-stable solids. The partially hydrogenated oils that would eventually be recognized as genuinely harmful to cardiovascular health were something her body was largely spared, not through any wisdom of her own, but through the timing of her existence. She was not eating seed oils in the quantities we now consume them, because the widespread use of high omega-6 vegetable oils in everything from restaurant fryers to packaged crackers was something that developed after her era. Her fat intake was, from a molecular standpoint, more similar to what a human body evolved eating than what the contemporary food supply provides. Her relationship with meat was different too. She ate meat, yes. Meat was the center of most dinners, But the meat she ate was different in several respects from the default meat of the modern American table. It was leaner, for one. The animals raised for food in the 1950s were not the corn-fed feedlot animals that would come to dominate American meat production in subsequent decades. They were animals that had generally been allowed to move around and eat their natural diets, which produced leaner, more nutrient-dense meat with a different fat profile. She used every part of the animal, the bones for stock, the liver and kidneys and heart that were considered perfectly ordinary eating, not exotic or difficult. The fatty offcuts that became the slow-cooked dishes that filled the kitchen with hours of aroma and fed the family economically and well. She did not eat only boneless, skinless chicken breasts, that paradigm of modern diet eating, stripped of everything that makes it flavorful, every time. And she ate less of it per serving than the modern American default. The pork chop on her plate was one pork chop, not two. The slice of pot roast was a slice, not a slab. The meat was central, yes, but it was surrounded by vegetables and starch and bread, and it was one component of a meal rather than the meal itself writ large. She slept. I want to come back to this because it belongs here, in this story about her body and its rhythms, as much as the food and the movement do. Sleep is one of the most powerful regulators of appetite, metabolism and body composition that we have, and in the 1950s, the average American slept significantly more than the average American does now. She went to bed at a predictable time, something between 9 and 10:30 on most nights, because there was less to keep her up. The television signed off. There was no phone with an infinite scroll of content available the moment her husband started snoring. There was no light from screens telling her nervous system that it was still daytime and keeping her cortisol elevated past the point when her biology wanted to wind down. The darkness was more complete. The quietness was more complete. The cues that her body received that it was time to sleep were clearer and less contradicted than they are for most people today. Sleep deprivation increases hunger. It increases cravings, specifically for high-calorie food. It impairs the body's ability to regulate the hormones that govern appetite, particularly leptin, which signals fullness, and ghrelin, which signals hunger. A person who is chronically short on sleep is fighting against their own biology every time they try to make careful food choices, because their body is insistently, chemically telling them to eat more and rest less. She was not fighting that battle most nights, because most nights she slept 7 or 8 hours in genuine darkness and genuine quiet, because the shape of her day and the structure of her world supported that. Now I want to talk about something that I think is rarely included in these kinds of retrospectives about 1950s health, and that is the role that social eating and social accountability played in her relationship with her body. She ate meals with other people, almost always, almost every day. Even if her husband was at work and the children were at school, she might eat lunch with a neighbor, or if she ate alone, it was an unusual and slightly noted event, a Tuesday when nobody was there, and she made herself a small sandwich and ate it at the table with the newspaper and thought it was oddly quiet. The baseline was sharing meals. Eating with others changes how you eat. People who eat with others tend to eat more slowly, because conversation interrupts eating. More slowly means more time for the body's satiety signals to catch up to consumption and communicate that fullness has arrived. It means more attention paid to the food itself. It means the meal has a social duration that is not just about getting calories in as efficiently as possible, but about the interaction surrounding the food. She also existed in a body-aware social environment that operated quite differently from ours. On one hand, the 1950s were extraordinarily pressured about women's appearances and bodies, and I do not want to minimize that pressure. The corset and the girdle and the obsessive smoothing of silhouettes and the magazine ideals of the era represent real, ongoing external pressure on women's bodies that was neither kind nor fair. We will talk about that. But on another level, there was a social accountability to ordinary physical maintenance that functioned as a gentle, ambient kind of motivation. She knew her neighbors, she saw them regularly, she attended church with them, and sat in the fellowship hall with them, and appeared at the school play and the block party. She was visible in her community in ways that people who work remotely and shop online and attend everything virtually are not. This visibility meant that her physical health and appearance were part of her social self in a way that she was continuously, lightly aware of. Not obsessively, not with the intensity of modern body image anxiety, which is a different and often much more damaging thing, but with a basic background awareness that she was a person who existed physically in a community where she would be seen. There is evidence from behavioral research that social visibility, the sense of being seen and known by people around you, is one of the factors that supports healthy behavior, not because you are performing for others, but because the social self and the physical self are genuinely connected in human psychology, and belonging to a community that knows you and sees you is a form of accountability that is both gentle and persistent. She could not fall off the map entirely. She was there on Sunday. She was there on Tuesday at the church auxiliary meeting. She was there when Mrs. Henderson stopped by unexpectedly. She was embedded in a physical community of people who knew what she looked like and would notice, gently, without saying anything necessarily, if she seemed unwell or depleted or less like herself than usual. Let me tell you about her kitchen now in more detail, because the kitchen is where most of the metabolic story of her life actually happened, and I want you to be able to see it. The kitchen was functional, not beautiful in the way that modern kitchen design aspires to beauty, not a showroom of granite and steel and concealed appliances, a room with a purpose, where every object was there because it was used, and where the organization reflected the order of operations in cooking rather than any aesthetic philosophy. On the counter by the stove, the salt box, because she reached for salt constantly and it needed to be at hand, the pepper grinder, perhaps a small crock with cooking utensils, wooden spoons and a rubber spatula and a slotted spoon, all in use regularly and therefore at hand, the cast iron skillet that lived on the back burner or on a hook near the stove, because she used it nearly every day, and washing it fully and putting it away and getting it out again was unnecessary friction. Cast iron. This is worth a moment of attention. The cast iron skillet that she cooked in, that her mother probably gave her, that was already 20 years old when she got it, is a cooking vessel with specific properties that differ from modern non-stick cookware in ways that have subtle nutritional implications. Cast iron requires more fat to cook in than coated non-stick surfaces, but it distributes heat differently, producing a particular kind of caramelization on the outside of food while keeping the inside tender, a process that develops flavor compounds that are genuinely satisfying in a way that reduces the desire to eat more. Food cooked well in a cast iron skillet is satisfying in a way that food cooked without attention to browning and texture often is not. Satisfaction matters. This is a thing that gets lost in calorie-focused discussions of food. The body has appetite regulators that operate on signals other than pure caloric content. The smell of food cooking, the visual appeal of a dish, the variety of textures in a meal, the complex flavors that develop during real cooking, all of these signals participate in the meal experience and influence how satisfied you feel when it is over. Highly processed foods are engineered to stimulate appetite while undermining genuine satisfaction, which is part of why it is so easy to keep eating them past the point of fullness. Real food, cooked with real techniques, tends to work the other way. A small amount of something genuinely delicious can satisfy in a way that a large quantity of something engineered to be compelling cannot. She understood this without knowing she understood it. She cooked things that tasted like things. She seasoned her food with attention. She let the onions actually brown before adding the next thing, because browned onions taste richer and deeper than briefly softened ones, and a meal that tastes rich and deep satisfied the senses in addition to satisfying the stomach. The pantry. Let us spend a moment in her pantry, because what was in there tells you everything about how she ate and why her eating had the structure it did. Canned goods, yes, but a limited and specific selection. Canned tomatoes, canned corn, canned green beans for the winter months, perhaps canned salmon or tuna as a protein that required no refrigeration and could become a quick lunch. Canned peaches or pears preserved in light syrup, not the heavy syrup that later versions would default to. The canned goods were a backup, a winter resource, not the primary way she ate. Dried goods. A large canister of flour, all-purpose, white. A smaller one of whole wheat. The sugar canister we have already met. Coffee in its can, oatmeal in a box, dried beans in a glass jar, several kinds, navy beans and kidney beans, and perhaps some lentils, rice, cornmeal, barley perhaps, which she used in soups and which is one of the most satiating grains that exists due to its unusually high beta-glucan fiber content. Breadcrumbs in a tin, for coating things that needed coating, the fat shelf, lard in its white cardboard container, butter in the refrigerator rather than the pantry, but she might have kept a small amount at room temperature if she baked frequently, because room temperature butter creams into cakes differently than cold butter. Vegetable shortening, yes, but used more sparingly than its modern reputation in nostalgia cooking would suggest. Olive oil in a small bottle, used for specific things, not poured liberally over everything. Vinegar, because vinegar was a cooking staple and a cleaning staple, and she kept both a white vinegar and an apple cider vinegar. Salt, a large cardboard cylinder, because she used salt in everything and needed it in quantity. Dried herbs, in small tins or in a hanging bundle near the kitchen window. Dried oregano, dried thyme, dried parsley, dried sage. A bay leaf jar, black pepper in a grinder, perhaps dried red pepper flakes if she liked a little heat. What was not in her pantry is as telling as what was. There were no chips, no crackers beyond perhaps a box of simple saltines and a box of graham crackers, no cookies in large quantities, because cookies were baked when cookies were wanted, not kept as a standing pantry supply. No boxed breakfast cereals beyond perhaps a simple oat cereal, or perhaps cornflakes, plain, eaten with milk and a small amount of sugar and nothing additional. No snack bars, no protein bars, no meal replacement anything. There was essentially nowhere to turn for casual, unplanned eating without making something. And making something takes time and intention and a willingness to dirty a pan. When you are tired, and it is 8 o'clock in the evening, and the kitchen is clean, the friction involved in making something casual to eat is sufficient to mean that you often do not. She drank water, plain water, from the tap, throughout the day, not always tracked, not always in a large labelled bottle she carried everywhere, but available, drunk when she was thirsty, consumed in natural quantities as she moved through the physical work of the day. Thirst was the signal, and she responded to it, generally with water, because water was what was in the kitchen, and getting something else required effort. Adequate hydration is metabolically significant in ways that get less attention than they probably should. The body's thirst signal and hunger signal are processed in overlapping systems, and mild dehydration can be misread as hunger, leading to eating when drinking would have been the appropriate response. She was unlikely to be chronically mildly dehydrated, because she was working physically, because she was paying attention to her body's signals as a matter of practical necessity, and because the beverages available to her that were not water were limited enough that water remained the default. She also drank milk, and this is worth a brief stop, because milk consumption in the 1950s was a significant and culturally supported dietary habit that has declined substantially since. Full-fat milk, because there was no other kind, at meals, particularly at dinner, sometimes at breakfast. The calcium and protein in milk are nutritionally valuable, and there is interesting research suggesting that dairy fat, specifically, the particular fat composition of whole milk, may have metabolic properties different from other fats, including potentially beneficial effects on satiety and weight management. But beyond any specific nutritional consideration, the milk at dinner was a glass of milk at dinner, not a soda. It was a beverage with significant nutritional content that replaced what might otherwise have been a sweetened or calorie-dense liquid accompaniment to the meal. Now let us talk about what happened in the afternoon, because the afternoon occupies an interesting metabolic space in the story of her day. Around 3 or 4 o'clock, there was sometimes a cup of tea, not always, but often enough to be worth noting. A cup of tea, maybe 2, sometimes with a small biscuit or a plain cookie, sitting down for 15 or 20 minutes before the dinner preparations began. This small pause in the day was not a formal practice with a name. It was just the habit of many women of the era, a remnant of an older tradition of afternoon tea that had simplified itself into a quiet cup in the kitchen before the evening's work. From a blood sugar management perspective, this small afternoon snack, if it happened, was not harmful and was arguably useful. The gap between lunch and dinner in a household where dinner was eaten at 5:30 or 6 was long enough that a small mid-afternoon intake could smooth out the blood sugar valley that might otherwise arrive around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, with its associated fatigue and irritability and increased appetite at dinner. A small, real food snack, plain crackers, or a piece of fruit or a simple cookie, was metabolically quite different from a 300-calorie snack bar engineered to be addictively palatable. Then dinner preparation began, and I want you to understand the physical reality of this, because it was not a small thing. Dinner was the main cooking event of the day, and it started earlier than you might expect because it took longer. She was not making 20-minute weeknight meals from a recipe app. She was making food that took time, because that was the nature of the food she was making. A pot roast that needed 2 hours in the oven, the potatoes that needed to be washed, peeled, cut and boiled, the green beans from the garden that needed to be snapped and washed and cooked, the gravy that needed to be made from the pan drippings after the roast came out, with careful whisking over the heat to incorporate the flour and reach the right consistency without lumps, the dinner rolls that she might have started rising earlier in the day. She stood in her kitchen for an hour or more most evenings, not in the miserable way, not always, but as a matter of course. The standing itself, combined with the movement of cooking, contributed to her daily activity total in a way that is genuinely significant. Standing uses more energy than sitting, not dramatically more, but measurably more, and over the course of an evening cooking a full dinner from scratch, the difference added up. She was also moving the whole time, checking on the roast, stirring the gravy, moving the rolls from their rising spot to the oven, getting the butter dish from the refrigerator, walking from the counter to the stove to the refrigerator and back in the efficient choreography of someone who has been cooking in the same kitchen for years and knows exactly where everything is. Dinner was served at the table, as we have established, and eaten in the communal way we have discussed. Portions were what they were. She had cooked enough for the family, with perhaps a small amount left over for tomorrow's lunch, not enough for everyone to have thirds. Enough for a real meal, and then the plates being empty, and then the dishes, again. She cleared the table, scraped the plates, washed everything, dried it, put it away. Every evening, the same sequence. The kitchen was restored to order before the day was truly done, and then, often, she sat down. The evening hours, after dinner and dishes and the children's baths and bedtime, were the quietest of her day. She might sew or knit, she might read, she might sit with her husband and watch the television program, which lasted an hour, and then was over. Not the infinite streaming library of content that expands to fill whatever time you give it. She sat and was still, and her body, which had been moving since early morning, was genuinely tired in the physical way that a body which has done real physical work all day is tired. That tiredness was its own regulator. A genuinely tired body does not stay up until midnight eating chips and watching things. A genuinely tired body goes to bed. She went to bed, and the cycle began again. I want to pause here and be honest about something because I think it is important. I have been describing her life in terms of its metabolic benefits, and those benefits were real, but I have been leaving out the context in which they existed, and the context is complicated. She did not live this way because it was healthy. She lived this way because this was the structure of her world. The labor she performed was not labor she chose for its physical benefits. It was labor that was expected of her, that the social structure around her demanded, that she could not opt out of without significant social consequence. The cooking and cleaning and child-rearing were not wellness practices. They were obligations, and they were often exhausting in ways that went beyond the physical. The social pressure around her body and her appearance was intense and often unkind. The girdle we have talked about, that structure of elastic and bone that she wore every day to smooth her silhouette into the approved shape, was not a health tool. It was discomfort endured in the service of other people's comfort with looking at her. The diet culture of the 1950s was real and painful, with women told constantly through magazines and television and advertising that their natural bodies were insufficient, that the right silhouette was achievable through the right products, that their worth was partly measured in their adherence to physical ideals that required genuine suffering to maintain. She was not free from that, and we should not pretend she was. She existed inside it daily. What I want to separate out, carefully and honestly, is the distinction between the social pressure she experienced around her body, which was often harmful, and the daily habits and structures that governed her relationship with food and movement, which had genuine metabolic benefits, regardless of whether they were chosen or arrived at through grace or suffering. The fact that her food was real and simply prepared and moderately portioned was not because she had cracked some dietary code. It was because the food system around her had not yet been industrialized in the ways that would make ultra-processed food the default. The fact that she moved throughout her day was not because she had designed an optimal activity routine. It was because the technology that would allow the average person to sit still for most of their waking hours had not yet fully arrived. She was metabolically advantaged by her era rather than by any particular wisdom, and the advantage was partly inseparable from a set of structural constraints that we would not want to reimpose. But here is the interesting question, and the reason this history matters. Is it possible to extract the metabolic benefits without reimposing the constraints? Can we eat real food in moderate portions without also erasing women's access to public life? Can we move more through the day without returning to a world where that movement was only available in the form of unpaid domestic labor? Can we honor the wisdom in the daily structures without romanticizing the oppression in which they were embedded? I think the answer is yes, with effort and attention, and that is why the story of her life is worth telling. Not to say we should go back, never to say that, but to illuminate what we have lost in the specific, concrete sense of daily habits and rhythms that served the body in ways we have not adequately replaced. Let us go deeper into the food now, because there are specific things she knew, practical things she would have described not as health wisdom, but simply as how you do it, that are genuinely worth recovering. She knew how to make stock. This is perhaps the most metabolically significant cooking skill in her repertoire, and the one that has most completely fallen away from the average modern kitchen. Stock, real stock made from bones, is one of the most nutritionally dense and metabolically useful foods that can be produced in a home kitchen, and she made it routinely, as a matter of course, because it was the obvious use of the chicken carcass, or the ham bone, or the beef knuckles she had bought cheaply from the butcher. The stock pot was put on the back burner Monday morning with the remains of Sunday's chicken, some water, an onion cut in half, a carrot, a stalk of celery if she had it, a bay leaf, a few peppercorns. It simmered, very quietly, for most of the day, filling the house with the particular deep smell of bones releasing their contents slowly into water. By afternoon, she had several quarts of golden stock that she would strain and store in the refrigerator, where the fat would rise and solidify on top and could be skimmed off, and under the fat, the clear, mineral-rich, protein-dense liquid that would become the base for soup, or the braising liquid for vegetables, or the moisture in a sauce. Bone stock is dense in collagen, which converts to gelatin during the long simmer, and which supports joint health and gut health in ways that have become the subject of considerable nutritional research. It is rich in minerals including calcium and magnesium and phosphorus that leach from the bones during cooking. It is deeply satisfying as a food and as a base for other foods in a way that commercial broth, which is essentially flavored water, is not. A bowl of soup made with real stock is genuinely different in its effect on hunger and satiety from a bowl of soup made with commercial broth or water. The gelatin in the stock thickens it slightly and slows its passage through the digestive system. The minerals and proteins provide genuine nourishment. The depth of flavor satisfies the senses in a way that thin commercial versions do not. She knew how to braise. Braising, the technique of cooking a tough cut of meat in a small amount of liquid in a covered pot in the oven at a low temperature for a long time, is the technique that transforms the cheap, flavorful, nutrient-dense cuts of an animal into the most satisfying food in the culinary repertoire. A braised short rib. A pot roast cooked until the collagen in the connective tissue has dissolved into gelatin and the meat falls apart with a spoon. A braised chicken thigh in tomatoes and garlic that has been cooking since noon and is ready when the family comes to the table. Braised dishes are metabolically interesting because they are extraordinarily satisfying per calorie. The gelatin from the connective tissue contributes to satiety. The fat in the dish is released slowly and contributes to the sense of fullness. The deeply developed flavors from the long cooking provide sensory satisfaction that reduces the desire to eat more. A portion of braised pot roast, with its accompanying vegetables and gravy, is a meal that the body recognizes as real food, responds to with appropriate satiety signals, and does not quickly require to be augmented with something else. She knew how to stretch. This is a cooking skill that has no glamour attached to it, and that the food media largely ignores because it is not interesting to photograph, but that was one of the most important competencies a 1950s woman had in her kitchen. The skill of making food go further without making it feel as though it has been stretched. The soup that used the vegetables from last night's dinner, chopped and added to the stock with some barley and a can of tomatoes, becoming something completely new rather than clearly left over. The hash that used last Sunday's roast beef, diced small and crisped in the skillet with potatoes and onion, so good that the children asked for it deliberately. The bread pudding that used the stale bread that would otherwise have been thrown away, soaked in milk and eggs, and baked until it puffed and browned, served with a simple sauce that made it feel like something someone had tried to make, rather than something that had happened because the bread went stale. Stretching food means cooking at a lower overall caloric density than buying a fresh piece of meat and cooking it alone every night. It means mixing expensive proteins with cheaper vegetables and grains in proportions that reduce the cost and calorie density per serving, while maintaining genuine nutritional completeness. It means using fat and aromatics strategically to create depth of flavor from modest ingredients so that the modest ingredients satisfy. A dish with a small amount of meat, thoroughly browned and seasoned, combined with a large quantity of beans and vegetables in a rich, flavorful sauce is nutritionally superior to a large piece of plain meat on its own, from the perspective of protein quality, fiber content, micronutrient density, and satiety. The 1950s cook who was stretching the meat budget was, without knowing it, producing meals that hit the nutritional targets we now aspire to with our grain bowls and our plant-forward cooking. She knew how to bake real things for special occasions and leave them as special occasions. This is the distinction that I find genuinely profound when I sit with it. The baked goods of the 1950s were genuinely good, genuinely indulgent. The butter cake and the chocolate layer cake and the lemon meringue pie were not pretending to be something other than what they were. They were not low-fat, not reduced sugar, not made with substitutes. They were the real article, and they were eaten on occasions: birthdays, church socials, the neighbor who had come for dinner, the visiting relatives. Sunday, sometimes, as the dessert after Sunday dinner that was itself the most elaborate meal of the week. The special occasion was what made them special, and the specialness was not diminished by making them better for you. It was maintained by making them only sometimes. She did not eat cake on Tuesday afternoon because Tuesday was Tuesday. She ate cake when there was a reason for cake. The rest of Tuesday's eating was ordinary food, and the absence of a perpetual dessert option did not feel like deprivation because the expectation was not there in the first place. This is the thing that the modern food environment has done to our baseline expectations. When sweet, rich, indulgent things are available everywhere, all the time, in portions that have been engineered to seem reasonable, the idea of eating them only on occasions begins to feel like restriction. But it is not restriction. It is simply the original structure of human eating, in which concentrated caloric resources were seasonal and precious, and therefore truly enjoyed when they arrived, because they were not the ambient background noise of daily life. She understood satiety in a practical, embodied way, not as a nutritional concept with a name, as the felt sense of having eaten enough, which was something she paid attention to because not paying attention to it meant making too little food and having hungry people at the table, or making too much and wasting it, and wasting food was not acceptable. She calibrated. She cooked enough and served appropriately, and the meal was done. This calibration meant that she was not, generally, in the modern eating mode of continuing to eat past the point of fullness, because the food was there and entertaining, and the screen was on, and the next episode was already loading. She ate until the meal was over. The meal ended, she was done, and the body, given sufficient time between that ending and the next meal, would use what it had received and be ready again at the appropriate time. There is a Japanese concept called hara-hachi-bu, which means eating until you are 80% full, and it has been associated with the longevity of communities in Okinawa and elsewhere. She did not know this concept. She would not have called what she did hara-hachi-bu, but the structure of her eating, the modest portions, the end of the meal as a genuine end, the long intervals between eating events, produced something functionally similar in its metabolic effect. Let me talk now about the social eating that happened outside her household, because it tells a different and interesting part of this story. When she ate outside her own kitchen, it was at other people's houses, at church potlucks, at the diner in town for a special occasion. At the drive-in, rarely, for a root beer float and maybe a hamburger that was the size of a hamburger in 1957, which was several ounces lighter than what a fast food chain now considers a standard serving. The restaurant meal was genuinely special, not something that happened weekly as a substitute for cooking, something that happened perhaps monthly, perhaps only a few times a year in modest households, and that was therefore experienced as a genuine departure from the norm, something savoured and remembered and discussed afterward. She did not eat restaurant food with the casual frequency that drags the modern American average daily calorie intake significantly above what home cooking would produce. The portions at restaurants in the 1950s were also different, not because restaurants were trying to be healthy, because the food culture and the economics of the era had not yet shifted toward the more is more logic that would come to define American restaurant dining. A hamburger was a quarter pound, fries were a small pile, not a mountain in a cardboard vessel the size of a flower pot. A milkshake was 12 ounces, not 32. The scale of everything was calibrated to a human body in a way that has been dramatically inflated since. She was also deeply embedded in a food culture that was regional, seasonal, and personal in ways that the globalized, year-round, industrialized food system has largely replaced. She knew what grew near her. She bought from people she recognized. She had opinions about whose eggs were best and which farm stand kept the best tomatoes, and whether the corner butcher or the grocery store butcher knew what they were doing with a lamb shoulder. This connection between herself and the source of her food was metabolically neutral, in the sense that knowing your egg farmer does not change the nutritional content of the egg, but it is not behaviorally neutral. There is evidence from food psychology research that people eat more slowly and with more attention when they feel a connection to the source and preparation of their food. Eating something that someone you know grew, cooked by your own hands, in your own kitchen, from a recipe your mother gave you, involves a level of presence and attention that buying a pre-packaged meal from a shelf and heating it in a microwave simply does not. And presence and attention are, in the end, the things that regulate eating most powerfully, not willpower, not restriction, not calorie counting, simply paying attention to what you are eating, where it came from, what went into it, and what your body is telling you as you eat it. She could not eat without paying attention, really, because eating inattentively while looking at a screen or driving or working was not something her daily life was structured to allow. The meal happened at the table. It happened at a time. It happened with people. It had a beginning and an end. And within that bounded, attentive event, the body did its job. It recognized real food. It produced appropriate satiety signals. It did not require to be tricked or disciplined. It simply needed the conditions in which its natural regulation could operate. Let us talk about the seasons now, because the seasonal dimension of her eating affected not just what she ate, but how her body moved through the year, and there is something in that worth understanding. In winter, she ate heavier food, root vegetables and beans and slow-cooked meats and dense breads and soups. She moved slightly less outdoors, though the indoor work continued regardless of season. Her body accumulated a small amount of additional insulating fat, perhaps, in the way that well-fed human bodies in winter always have. She slept more, because the nights were longer and there was less to do in the evenings, and the cold encouraged warmth and rest. In spring, the food changed. Fresh greens appeared and were eaten with a genuine appetite that had been building since October. The lighter proteins of spring, the eggs from hens that were laying again, the spring lamb, the first peas. She began to spend more time outside, because the garden needed starting and the yard needed attending, and the weather was inviting. The body responded to the change in food and light and movement with the subtle metabolic adjustment that seasonal living allows, a lightening, a shift in energy. In summer, the food was at its freshest and most abundant. She was outside more, she was more active, in the garden and in the outdoor work that summer allows. She was sweating, which is not nothing as a contributor to water balance and mineral cycling. She was eating the vegetables at their peak, the meat at its most grass-fed, the fruit at its most genuinely ripe and sweet and nutrient-dense. In fall, the preservation work intensified, the canning and the storage and the preparation for winter. The physical labor of autumn food preservation was significant, and the food became richer again as the season turned, as the apples were pressed and the squash were harvested, and the last tomatoes were put up, and the winter ahead began to be felt. This seasonal cycle, this modulation of food and activity and sleep across the year, mirrors what evolutionary biologists believe the human body was shaped to experience. Our metabolic systems did not evolve in the context of year-round food abundance. They evolved in the context of seasonal variation, of times of plenty and times of relative scarcity, of different foods at different times of year, of activity levels that matched the demands of the season. We have removed seasonal variation almost entirely from the modern food experience, and the consequences of that removal are multiple and complex. She had not removed it because she could not. The world she lived in had not yet permitted its removal. Now let me talk about something that intersects with all of this in an unexpected way, which is the physical architecture of her social world and how it shaped her body without her noticing. She climbed stairs. Houses in the 1950s, and particularly older houses in which many 1950s families lived, had stairs. Bedrooms were upstairs. The laundry might be in the basement. She went up and down multiple times a day, carrying things, because you always carry something when you go upstairs or downstairs in a functioning household. Clean laundry going up, dirty laundry going down, children needing things, things needing to be retrieved or put away. Stair climbing is one of the highest intensity movements that ordinary daily life requires. The cardiovascular demand of carrying a laundry basket up a flight of stairs is genuinely significant. She did this in the easy, unthinking way of someone who does not regard going upstairs as exercise, but simply as the way you reach things that are upstairs. She kneeled and crouched and reached. The physical positions that domestic work requires are extraordinarily varied and engage muscles and joints in patterns that formal exercise rarely replicates. Kneeling to clean the bathtub, crouching to reach the back of the lower cabinet, reaching overhead to put something on the high shelf, bending to pick up children, to make beds, to pull weeds, to pick up what has been dropped. The range of motion required for basic housekeeping is, from a physiological standpoint, genuinely comprehensive. She carried weight. A full laundry basket weighs 10 to 15 pounds. A full grocery bag weighs more, and she might carry 2 or 3 of them from the car or from the store. A cooking pot full of water before it has been drained weighs more than you would think. The bags of flour and sugar and dog food and the other heavy pantry staples that she bought and carried home and stored were genuinely weighty objects that required her body to do real work with real loads. She was casually, continuously doing the kind of functional resistance work that fitness trainers now specifically design programs to replicate, because the natural resistance of daily life has been removed from most modern existences. She gardened, squatted, dug, lifted. The vegetable garden in summer was a full-body workout disguised as food production. The rhythmic bending and reaching and carrying and squatting of garden work uses the hips and legs and back in patterns that strengthen the posterior chain, the network of muscles running from the backs of the legs through the glutes and lower back, which is the exact set of muscles that chronic sitting weakens and that is associated with back pain and reduced metabolic function. She was not training her posterior chain, she was growing tomatoes. The effect was the same. Let us talk about stress now, because stress is deeply metabolically relevant, and the 1950s had their own relationship with stress that was different from the chronic, always-on, nowhere-to-escape stress of the modern world in ways that mattered. She worried. Of course she worried. She worried about money and children and the state of her marriage and what the neighbors thought and whether the roast would be dry and whether her mother was well. She worried with the full human capacity for anxiety that has not changed since human beings existed. But the structure of her worry was different. It had natural bounds in a way that modern anxiety often does not. When she put the children to bed and did the dishes and sat down at 8 o'clock and turned on the television, the things she had been worrying about were, for that hour or two, not actively competing for her attention, the way a smartphone can deliver worry at any moment of any day. She could not check the news at 2 in the morning. The news was not available at 2 in the morning. The newspaper would come tomorrow. The worrying she did at 2 in the morning was her own private worry, not amplified and curated and algorithmically optimized to keep her in a state of anxious attention. The chronic, low-grade stress response that cortisol elevation produces has significant metabolic consequences. Elevated cortisol increases appetite, particularly for high-calorie, high-fat, high-sugar foods. It directs the body to store fat preferentially in the abdominal region. It impairs sleep, which in turn further elevates cortisol, in a cycle that is genuinely difficult to interrupt. She did not escape stress, but the stress had natural daily endpoints, natural pauses, natural recovery windows that the always-on, always-connected world of chronic information exposure has largely eliminated. And those pauses, those natural low points in the cortisol cycle, when the nervous system was allowed to rest and restore, were part of what allowed her body to regulate itself across the day and the week in the way it was designed to do. She also moved through stress in a way that the physical nature of her work required and enabled. Physical movement is one of the most effective metabolic interventions for stress that we know of. It burns off the adrenaline and cortisol that the stress response produces. It engages the muscles and the cardiovascular system in the way that the fight-or-flight response was designed to be resolved. The woman who had a frustrating morning and went to the kitchen and kneaded bread dough with her hands, pulling and stretching and folding and pushing, was doing something neurobiologically effective for her stress response that she probably called nothing more sophisticated than needing to do something with her hands. Physical labor as stress regulation, not as a therapeutic practice, as the unavoidable physical structure of a day that required you to keep moving, regardless of your emotional state. Now let us talk about something I have been circling around, which is the question of what she drank in the evening, and specifically whether she drank alcohol, because this is one of the more interesting social and metabolic stories of the 1950s that gets less attention than it might. She might have had a drink in the evening. The cocktail hour, that stylized social ritual of the mid-20th century, was a real feature of middle-class American domestic life in the 1950s. Her husband coming home and mixing a drink, a glass of sherry for her before dinner, a beer with the meal, occasionally. The social drinking of the era was genuinely present, but it was bound by the structure of the day in a way that modern drinking often is not. It happened at the designated time, in the evening, as a social ritual. It was not all-day drinking, not drinking alone during the workday, not the bottle of wine consumed gradually across a solo evening of streaming content. It was a glass, or perhaps two, in a social context, at a predictable time, and then the evening moved on. The caloric content of alcohol is real, and often underestimated, and this was true for her as well, but the bounded, structured nature of her drinking when she drank meant that its metabolic impact was contained in the way that alcohol consumed continuously, or in large quantities simply is not. She also ate before she drank, generally, or drank with food, because the cocktail hour either preceded dinner or accompanied it, and eating before drinking is one of the most effective strategies for moderating alcohol's metabolic and social effects, simply because food slows the absorption of alcohol and reduces its impact. Let me come back to her body itself now, because I want to talk about how she understood it and what that understanding meant for how she lived in it. She did not monitor her body. not in the quantified, tracked, measured way that has become the contemporary approach to physical self-awareness. She did not wear a device that counted her steps and her sleep stages and her heart rate variability and her blood oxygen levels. She did not weigh herself daily and chart the results. She did not calculate her basal metabolic rate or determine her macronutrient ratios. She knew her body the way you know something you have lived in for decades. She knew when she felt well and when she did not. She knew when she was genuinely hungry and when she was eating from habit or boredom. She knew what foods agreed with her and what did not from any systematic elimination protocol, but from a lifetime of paying attention to how she felt after she ate things. This embodied experiential knowledge is different from the quantified, external measurement knowledge that modern wellness culture prioritizes, and in some ways it is more useful. It is knowledge about your specific body, your specific reactions, your specific rhythms, accumulated over years of direct experience. It is not transferable as data, not shareable as a graph, not impressive as a metric, but it is real knowledge, and it guided her in a way that was responsive to her actual state rather than to a number on a scale. She also did not have a problematic relationship with her body's natural rhythms in the way that modern fitness culture sometimes promotes. She understood, practically, that she would be more tired some days than others, that some days eating was more satisfying than others, that her body changed across the month, if she was still in the years of those changes, and that those changes were normal and not to be fought. She did not have the cultural framework to optimize her exercise around her menstrual cycle and peak at specific hormonal windows, but neither did she have the framework that tells women their natural cycle is something to be overridden in the pursuit of a constantly available, high-performing physical self. She rested when she was tired, not always as much as she wanted to, because the work was always there, and the work had no designated day off in the way that an office job does. But she sat down, she put her feet up in the afternoon when she could. She napped, sometimes, when the house was quiet and the morning work was done and the afternoon work had not yet begun, lying down on the bed in her housecoat for 40 minutes, that she called just closing my eyes for a minute, and that left her genuinely refreshed in the way that genuine, brief sleep does. The afternoon rest, in various forms, appears across many cultures as a recognized human need, a recalibration point in the middle of the day when the post-meal dip in alertness meets the body's genuine need for a brief period of reduced activity. She honored that need when she could, not because she had read anything about sleep cycles, but because it felt necessary, and her body's signals were things she responded to, rather than overriding. Let me talk about her movement through the community now, because this is a dimension of the story that connects her physical habits to something larger and more social. She walked in her neighborhood as a social activity, not speed walking for exercise, though she moved with purpose, walking to see people, walking because the evening was warm and the children needed to run around, walking because she had to return the dish to Mrs. Anderson, and it seemed wrong to drive 4 houses when her legs worked perfectly well. This social walking was communal in a way that the solitary, headphones-in, step-count-focused walking of the contemporary exerciser is not. When you walk to visit a neighbor, you talk to people you pass on the way. You stop at the corner to exchange a few words with the man trimming his hedge. You arrive at your destination and talk for 20 minutes before you walk home. The social dimension of the walk adds mental engagement, connection, and the particular quality of presence that comes from being physically embedded in your neighborhood in a way that driving everywhere removes. She also, in many cases, danced. The social dances that were part of community life in the 1950s, the church socials, the neighborhood parties, the Saturday night occasions at the VFW hall or the local ballroom if you were in a larger town, were genuine physical activity disguised as entertainment and celebration. Dancing is among the most metabolically demanding, sustained physical activities that exists, engaging the whole body through a range of movement patterns and doing so for extended periods in a way that time spent at a party simply does not feel like exercise. She was not dancing every night, but the regularity with which social dancing appeared as a feature of ordinary community life meant that a substantial portion of her peer group was getting genuine physical activity in a context of pleasure and connection that made the activity self-sustaining because people do things they enjoy. Let us now slow down and spend some time with the specific meals of a specific week in her kitchen, because I want the abstract patterns we have been discussing to land in something concrete and sensory, something you can actually see and smell and feel the texture of. Monday. The weekend is over. The roast chicken from Sunday dinner is a carcass in the refrigerator, stripped of its meat and waiting. She puts it in the stock pot with water, the leek from the refrigerator that is starting to get soft, a carrot, some peppercorns. She puts this on the back burner, on the lowest possible heat, and leaves it there. Breakfast was scrambled eggs, 2 each, with toast and coffee. The eggs took 7 minutes. They were seasoned well with salt and a little bit of the cream she had bought on Saturday. They were yellow and soft, and the toast was from the bread she baked on Saturday, slightly firmer now, still good, buttered generously. Lunch was a bowl of the leftover potato soup from Friday, reheated, with crackers and a glass of milk. The soup had improved over the weekend. Soups always do. By afternoon, the stock was golden and fragrant, and she strained it and refrigerated it, and by the time the fat had risen and solidified on top, she would have 2 quarts of the clearest, most flavorful stock she had made in weeks. She also did the laundry on Monday, the sheets from all 3 beds, the week's worth of towels, the children's school clothes. By late morning she had the line full, the sheets white against the blue October sky, snapping slightly in the wind. Dinner was a simple thing made from the stock. She made barley soup with the neck meat she had pulled off the chicken, the diced carrots and celery from the refrigerator, a can of tomatoes. The barley simmered in the stock until it was fat and tender. With the soup she served the last of the bread, and after dinner she cut a small piece from the apple cake she had made on Sunday. She walked to the mailbox twice that day. She went upstairs 4 times that she counted, not counting. She knelt by the bathtub to clean it in the afternoon. She stood at the stove for a total of perhaps 45 minutes across all 3 meals. She carried the wet laundry basket out to the line and the dry laundry back inside. She moved through her day with the continuous, purposeful, never-counted movement of a person for whom stillness is the exception. Tuesday. She ironed in the morning the shirts from the laundry that needed pressing before they went in the wardrobe, standing at the ironing board in the kitchen for an hour while the radio was on and she listened to the program she liked. After ironing, she walked to the grocery store, which was 6 blocks, because she needed milk and butter, and the corner grocery was on the way to the post office, and she had a letter to mail. She was gone for 35 minutes, and came back with a full bag in each hand, and the walk had taken those full bags past 3 neighbors she had said hello to, past the church where the notice board was being updated, past the bakery whose smell was impossible to walk by without slowing down. She did not go in the bakery. She had things at home for lunch. Lunch was a bowl of the barley soup from last night, still good and perhaps even better, with 2 crackers and a few slices of cheese, and then the apple she had been meaning to eat since yesterday, sitting at the table in the quiet of the house, with the radio turned low, looking out the kitchen window at the garden. Dinner was pork chops, browned in the cast-iron skillet with salt and pepper and a small amount of lard, until the crust on the outside was deep golden and the inside was cooked through, but barely, still just slightly pink and very tender. Alongside was applesauce that she had made in September and canned, opened now and served cold from the jar in a small bowl beside the plate, and mashed potatoes, real ones, boiled and put through the ricer and beaten with butter and a little cream and salt until they were smooth and white and could not have been mistaken for anything made from a box. Wednesday. The church auxiliary met in the afternoon, and she walked there, 12 minutes each way. She brought the ginger snaps she had made yesterday evening after the children were in bed, pressed out and baked in 15 minutes, thin and crisp and fragrant, on a plate covered with waxed paper. Breakfast was oatmeal, made with milk, topped with a spoonful of the brown sugar from the kitchen canister and a small handful of raisins. The children liked it, and so did she, and it was warm, and it kept everyone from being hungry until noon. Lunch was an egg salad sandwich, which required the boiling of 2 eggs that morning, 20 minutes of waiting, the chopping and mixing with a small amount of mayonnaise and a little mustard and salt, spread between 2 slices of bread. With it, a handful of carrot sticks that she cut while she was in the kitchen anyway, and milk. At the church auxiliary, she ate 1 ginger snap and drank a cup of coffee and listened to the discussion about the Christmas fair and said what she thought about the table arrangement and walked home in the November afternoon with the leaves blowing across the road. Dinner was chicken thighs, braised. She had bought them on Tuesday's grocery run, knowing they would be dinner tonight. She browned them in the skillet first, skin side down, letting them render their own fat until the skin was crisp and golden and the kitchen smelled like the best possible thing. Then she added onion and garlic and a cup of the tomatoes from the pantry and a splash of vinegar and some thyme, covered the skillet and slid it in the oven at 350 degrees for an hour. While it cooked, she made rice on the stovetop, plain white rice cooked in the rest of the stock from Monday, and a simple salad of iceberg lettuce with vinegar dressing. When it came out, the sauce had thickened and the chicken was falling off the bone, and the whole thing tasted like it had taken 3 times as long as it had. She sat down to dinner with her family. She listened to what the children said had happened at school. She talked to her husband about his day. She ate her chicken thigh and her rice and her salad, and she was full when she finished and did not look for anything else. Thursday, she cleaned. Let me be honest about Thursday. Thursday was the day the cleaning happened that kept the house in the condition she wanted it to be in for the weekend, when there might be guests, or simply when the week had been too full to do everything that needed doing. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her knees. She cleaned the bathroom with bleach water and a brush. She dusted every horizontal surface in the living room and the dining room and the children's rooms. She vacuumed the rugs. She changed the bathroom towels. She took the kitchen curtains down and washed them in the sink and hung them to dry. She ate lunch standing at the kitchen counter while looking at the floor she had just cleaned and deciding it needed one more pass near the stove. Lunch was cheese and crackers and a glass of milk, eaten in 4 minutes because there was more to do. By 4 in the afternoon she was tired in the particular way that physical labor produces, the tiredness that is in the muscles rather than in the mind, the tiredness that does not prevent sleep but accelerates it. Dinner Thursday was simple because of the cleaning. She made a pot of navy bean soup using the beans that had been soaking since Wednesday night and a piece of the smoked ham hock that she had bought for exactly this purpose. The soup made itself, essentially bubbling on the back burner, while she washed her hands and changed out of her work dress into something cleaner. With the soup she served the cornbread that she had made that afternoon, a simple pan of it, not sweet, with a faint crust on the bottom from the cast-iron skillet she had preheated in the oven before pouring in the batter. The bean soup and the cornbread together are, from a nutritional standpoint, one of the most complete plant-forward meals that American cooking has produced. The beans provide protein and enormous quantities of fiber and resistant starch. The cornmeal provides additional carbohydrate and some micronutrients. The combination of the two provides a complementary amino acid profile that makes the protein from the beans more biologically useful than it would be eaten alone. She knew none of this. She knew it was good and filling and made enough for tomorrow's lunch. Friday. The week's end was near, and the family wanted something a little special for Friday dinner, not because Friday was a religious occasion for them necessarily, but because Friday marked the turning toward the weekend, and the children asked for it, and she was in the mood for something that required a little attention. She made pot roast, not the quick kind, the real kind. She had bought a chuck roast on Tuesday, knowing it would need the whole day on Friday. She browned it in the Dutch oven in the morning, all 6 sides, in the rendered fat from the plate of bacon ends she had cooked for breakfast, until every surface was deep mahogany and the kitchen smelled like the inside of a steakhouse. She added onions and carrots and celery and a can of tomatoes and the rest of the stock and a sprig of thyme from the dried bunch by the window. She covered it and put it in the oven at 300 degrees and left it there while she did everything else the day required. By 5 in the afternoon, the entire house smelled like the pot roast, the low, deep, sweet smell of long-cooked beef and vegetables, and the faint sweetness of the caramelized onions and the tomato that had reduced into the braising liquid over 6 hours. She pulled it out, and the meat yielded to a fork like it was made of soft cloth. She made egg noodles from scratch, because Friday deserved egg noodles, and because she had made them so many times that the recipe was in her hands rather than on any card. Flour and eggs and a little salt, mixed and kneaded and rolled thin on the floured board and cut into long strips and boiled briefly and tossed with butter. Dinner was pot roast on egg noodles with the vegetables from the braise and the gravy made from the braising liquid. Nobody got up from the table until the pot was empty. This was a week of ordinary eating in 1957, not special occasion eating, not holiday eating, just the ordinary everyday food of an ordinary woman in an ordinary household, made from real ingredients, cooked with attention and skill, eaten at a table with her family at regular times, in portions that were calibrated to need rather than to desire. I want to step back now from the specific and return to the pattern, because the pattern is what matters, and the pattern is what we can take with us. What was she doing, at its core? She was eating real food. Food made from recognizable ingredients, prepared by hands that had touched each component, seasoned by a person who knew her family's preferences and adjusted accordingly. Not food that had been manufactured in a facility and packaged and transported and designed by people whose job it was to make it more addictive and less filling than food cooked in a kitchen should be. She was eating in rhythm, 3 times a day, at predictable times, with long windows between eating during which her body was not processing new food but attending to the maintenance and regulation work that it could only do in the absence of continuous caloric input. She was moving through the day, not in concentrated bursts of formal exercise, followed by long hours of stillness, but continuously, in the small ways that add up to something significant. Standing, carrying, climbing, walking, kneeling, reaching, all the physical demands of a life that had not yet been fully automated and optimized for effortlessness. She was sleeping adequately, in a darkness that was real and a quiet that was nearly complete, in a structure of days that had natural beginnings and natural endings and did not extend infinitely in both directions via a device that could deliver stimulation or anxiety at any moment. She was eating seasonally, and the seasonality provided the nutritional variety and the metabolic rhythm that year-round abundance has removed from the modern experience. Her body cycled through the year with the food supply rather than against it. She was eating with others, in a social structure that made eating a bounded communal event with a beginning and an end, rather than a continuous background behavior that accompanied everything else she did. And she was not fighting her biology. She was, for the most part, operating within it, honoring its hunger signals when they arose, stopping when the meal was done, sleeping when she was tired, moving because the day required movement, resting when the work was finished. She was not trying to override her body's wisdom. She was, largely, following it. Now I want to talk about the ways in which what she was doing is actually harder to replicate than it sounds, because I think honesty here serves you better than a simple set of recommendations, and because the difficulty is real and worth acknowledging. The food she ate required time she may not have had. Cooking from scratch takes time. Not enormous amounts of time if you know what you are doing, but real time every day that has to come from somewhere. In a household with 2 incomes and the full complexity of modern life, the 45 minutes she spent on dinner preparation is a genuinely contested resource. We have fewer of those minutes than she did, partly because we work more hours, partly because the domestic labor that filled her day has been redistributed in ways that are sometimes more equitable and sometimes simply absent, leaving gaps that packaged food and takeout containers have rushed in to fill. The physical activity she accumulated was embedded in labor that was often unpaid, often unacknowledged, and often exhausting in ways that went beyond the physical. We should not long to return to a structure in which metabolic health was incidentally maintained by the requirements of a social system that kept women confined to domestic spaces and denied them full participation in public life. The solution to the modern movement deficit is not that women should go home and clean their own floors. It is that the world needs to be redesigned to incorporate more movement into the lives of all people, including through urban design, workplace structure, and the conscious restoration of physical activity to daily life in forms that do not require the recreation of the 1950s household. The portion sizes she ate required a food environment that no longer exists. You cannot simply choose smaller portions when the default serving size of everything around you has been calibrated to something larger. You cannot simply stop at one serving when the packaged food in your pantry is engineered to undermine satiety and drive consumption past the point of genuine need. The battle for appropriate portions is not a battle of willpower. It is a battle against an entire industry that has invested billions of dollars in making appropriate portions feel inadequate. She did not have to fight that battle. It had not yet been started when she was eating. The simplicity of her food required a food system that has been comprehensively dismantled. The food she ate was available because the food system of her era was organized differently. Fewer processing steps, fewer ingredients, more local, more seasonal. Less designed for shelf stability and sensory manipulation, and less of the infrastructure of industrial food production that has made ultra-processed food cheaper and more available than real food in much of the country. Choosing to eat the way she ate requires now either significant extra expense or significant extra effort, or both. For people with limited time and limited income, the way she ate is genuinely not accessible in the form it took in her kitchen. This is a structural problem with profound public health implications that a list of 1950s dietary habits does not solve. So, what can we do with all of this? Not a return to the 1950s, not a recommendation that women cook from scratch for hours while their partners watch television, not a nostalgia for an era that was, for many people, far more constrained and painful than the metabolic habits embedded in it might suggest. What we can do is notice. We can notice that the body's basic needs for real food, for moderate portions, for regular movement, for adequate sleep, for periods of non-eating, for social meals with beginning and ends, have not changed since the 1950s. The biology is the same, the needs are the same. We can notice that many of the habits she had, the ones we have been tracing across her week, are reproducible, at least in their essential form, without reconstructing the world she lived in. You can cook 1 or 2 things from scratch on a weekday evening without spending an hour in the kitchen. You can eat at a table without a screen, sometimes, even just on weekdays. You can walk to the corner store instead of ordering delivery, sometimes. You can make your own soup, sometimes. and find that it takes less time than you thought and tastes like the thing it actually is. You can put your phone across the room at 9:30 in the evening and let the darkness tell your nervous system that the day is done. You can eat your lunch sitting down at the actual table, not at your desk. You can carry your grocery bags from the car to the house instead of using the cart to the door. None of these things is sufficient on its own to replicate the metabolic environment of the 1950s household, but each of them moves in the direction of a body that is more active, more rested, more metabolically aligned with its own biology than the default of modern life tends to support. She did not have a secret. That is the thing I want to leave you with, I think. She had a structure, and the structure supported her body's natural regulation. She had an era, and the era had not yet invented most of the things that disrupt that regulation. She had a kitchen and a garden and a neighborhood and a schedule and a set of skills that together created the conditions in which a human body can maintain itself without extraordinary effort, without constant vigilance, without the exhausting, ongoing battle against an engineered food environment that is specifically designed to undermine it. The secret, if we must call it that, is that there is no secret. There is only the patient, daily work of feeding yourself real food in reasonable quantities, moving through the day in ways that your body was built for, sleeping in the darkness at predictable times, and letting your biology do the rest. She knew this not because she had learned it, but because she had never unlearned it. And learning it again, piece by piece, habit by habit, meal by meal, is the real work. Not dramatic, not fast, not likely to produce the transformation promised by any product or program or optimization protocol. Just the patient, ordinary, extraordinarily powerful work of returning to the rhythms the human body was made for. The afternoon light is going now, in whatever season you are reading this, in whatever corner of the world you are in. Somewhere, in some kitchen, something is simmering on a back burner. The smell of it is the smell of time and care, and there is a woman who put it there and will go back to check on it in a while, and she will serve it at the table when it is ready, and someone will sit down across from her and eat. The dishes will need washing afterward. The kitchen will need putting right. Tomorrow the whole thing begins again. This is not a small thing. It never was. Come back when you need to. Sleepy old world will be here. There is a particular quality of late afternoon in October that I have been thinking about as we have been sitting with all of this. The light comes in at a low angle and catches the steam from the soup pot and makes the kitchen look like a painting of itself, rich and amber and domestic in the very old sense of that word, meaning of the home, belonging to the home, native to the home. She would not have noticed it probably. She was too busy, but it was there, every October, that light and that steam, and somehow it has survived in the memory of anyone who ever walked into a kitchen where something was being cooked slowly and well. There is something almost ceremonial about that, something lost, now, teeth. Because no story of 18th century hygiene is complete without teeth, and the story of teeth in the 1700s is both more and less grim than you probably expect, depending on which direction you look at it from. The grim part first. Dental care in the 18th century was not what we would recognize as dental care today. There were no dentists in the modern sense. There were tooth drawers, sometimes barbers who had taken on the additional service of extraction, sometimes traveling practitioners who set up in market towns and pulled teeth for a fee. There were, by the late 1700s, a small number of actual dental practitioners in cities like Philadelphia and Boston, men who had trained abroad or apprenticed with someone who had, and who could do more than just extract. But for the vast majority of people in colonial America, dentistry meant enduring until a tooth hurt badly enough that it needed to come out, and then either finding someone to do it, or, in rural areas, sometimes having it done at home with whatever tools were available. The result, by the standards of our century, was considerable tooth loss. Adults in their 30s and 40s missing multiple teeth was not unusual. Adults who had lost most of their teeth by middle age were common enough that it was not remarkable. George Washington, the first president of the United States, is probably the most famous example. By the time he was inaugurated in 1789, he had only one natural tooth remaining. He had been losing teeth since his 20s, almost certainly due to a combination of the dental practices of the era, aggressive treatments with mercury-based compounds that were used for various illnesses and wreaked havoc on dental health, and possibly some hereditary factor as well. His dentures, which were not made of wood despite the persistent legend, were made from a combination of human teeth, cow and horse teeth, and ivory, and they were uncomfortable in ways that apparently influenced his public demeanor, contributing to the tight-jawed expression so familiar from his portraits. But here is the less grim part, or at least the more complicated part. People in the 18th century did clean their teeth. They did not use a nylon-bristled toothbrush and fluoride toothpaste, but they had practices, and some of them worked reasonably well. The most common tooth-cleaning method in colonial America involved a cloth, often wrapped around a finger, and a tooth powder. Tooth powders of the era varied considerably depending on what was available and what the person using them had been told was effective. The more common varieties included chalk, pulverized cuttlebone, ground charcoal, and salt, sometimes mixed together and sometimes used individually. Charcoal, in particular, is genuinely effective as a mild abrasive, and the practice of using it has seen a small revival in certain corners of modern natural health culture, which is an interesting little loop of history. Richer households might have access to toothbrushes, bristle brushes with bone or ivory handles that had been imported from England, since domestic brush manufacturing in the colonies was limited. These brushes were luxury items, not everyday tools for ordinary farmers. The wealthy man in his Boston townhouse had a different dental kit than the woman in the Connecticut River Valley farmhouse. There were also tooth-cleaning sticks, small twigs of certain trees that were chewed at the end to fray them into a brush-like texture. This practice was ancient, used in various forms across cultures from antiquity onward, and it persisted into the 18th century, particularly in rural areas where manufactured goods were harder to come by. Tooth pain was managed in a number of ways, many of them more colorful than effective. Oil of cloves was used as a topical anesthetic, which actually does work. Clove oil contains eugenol, which has genuine numbing properties and is still used in dentistry today. Various herbal preparations were applied to sore gums. Strong spirits were sometimes held against a painful tooth. None of these were cures, but they were not nothing either. What they were eating also matters here, and this is one of the places where the 18th century had a genuine, if unintentional, advantage over later periods. The average diet of an ordinary colonial family was low in refined sugar. Sugar was expensive, imported, used sparingly as a seasoning or for special occasions in most households. The real sugar consumption that began devastating teeth across the population came later, with industrialization and the mass production of cheap refined sugar in the 19th century. Before that, before sugar became cheap and ubiquitous, tooth decay followed a different pattern. The back teeth of 18th century skulls, when examined by modern researchers, tell a story of less widespread decay than we might expect, particularly among the rural poor, whose diet was largely grain, meat, and vegetables, with very little sweetener of any kind. The front teeth tell a different story, because they were used as tools, for gripping, for holding, for tearing, for work that modern people would reach for a knife or a pair of pliers to do. The wear patterns on colonial-era teeth reflect a life in which the mouth was regularly employed as a third hand, and that use took its own kind of toll. So the picture of teeth in the 1700s is not a picture of universal neglect. It is a picture of different risks, different practices, different standards, and different resources, all operating together to produce outcomes that were sometimes surprisingly okay and sometimes quite devastating, depending on who you were and what you had access to. Let us move further down the body. Hair. Hair in the 18th century is one of the great topics of its era, and I say that without exaggeration, because the social, economic, and daily practical dimensions of hair management in colonial America and in Britain in the 1700s are genuinely dense and layered and full of unexpected detail. We touched briefly in earlier parts of this story on the practice of not washing hair frequently, and on the boar bristle brush as the central tool of hair management. But I want to go deeper with this, because I think the full picture is richer than it first appears. The dominant hair fashion for women in the middle of the 18th century, in both Britain and the American colonies, was for hair that was dressed, meaning styled and arranged with deliberate structure, and often powdered. The elaborate powdered hairstyles of the mid to late 1700s, the ones that appear in portraits and are sometimes mocked for their extravagance, were actually mostly a feature of upper-class urban life. The woman in the Connecticut River Valley was not doing anything like that. Her hair was pinned up, covered under a linen cap or a bonnet, for most of her waking hours, and managed practically rather than decoratively. For her, hair management meant a few core practices: regular brushing to distribute the natural oils and prevent matting, occasional combing out with a fine-tooth comb that served both styling and the other purpose fine-tooth combs had served for thousands of years before her, occasional washing with whatever was at hand, and keeping it covered. The kept covered part deserves emphasis. The indoor cap, that simple white linen covering that appears on virtually every woman in domestic scenes from the 18th century, was not purely decorative, it was functional. It kept hair from falling into food being prepared. It kept hair clean between washings by protecting it from the smoke and soot and general atmospheric debris of a kitchen where a fire burned all day. It absorbed the forehead sweat of hard physical labor without that sweat immediately reaching the hair. It was, in a practical sense, part of the hygiene system. The fine-tooth comb had been a tool of personal grooming since ancient Egypt, and its persistence through the centuries without essential modification is itself a kind of testimony to how well it worked. Run a fine-tooth comb through hair slowly and carefully, section by section, from roots to ends, and you will remove what needs to be removed. This was understood by people in the 1700s who could not have explained the biology of it any more than they could explain why soap worked, but who knew from observation and practice that it did. Hair washing, when it happened, was done with whatever was available. Eggs were a common hair washing agent, used alone or beaten into water, effective as a mild cleanser and conditioning agent because of their protein content. Rye flour was used similarly, worked through dry or slightly damp hair, and then brushed out, a technique that functions somewhat like a dry shampoo, absorbing excess oil and adding a bit of body and texture. Rainwater was prized for washing hair when available, because it was soft water free of the minerals that hard well water contained, and soft water lathered better and rinsed cleaner. Herbal rinses were common. Rosemary water, made by steeping fresh or dried rosemary in hot water and allowing it to cool, was used as a final rinse after washing, both for its pleasant smell and for a belief, persistent across centuries, that rosemary stimulated scalp health and hair growth. Modern research has actually found some support for this. Rosemary does have properties that may improve scalp circulation, which is relevant to hair growth. The colonial woman rinsing her hair in rosemary water did not know why it might be good for her hair. She knew her mother had done it, and her grandmother before that, and her hair seemed to do well enough. The full-scale hair washing event, whatever form it took, happened infrequently, perhaps once a month in winter, somewhat more often in summer when outdoor bathing in streams and rivers made the whole process less effortful. Between washings, the brush and the comb and the cap did the maintenance work, and the natural oils of the scalp, properly distributed and regularly managed, served their intended purpose. Men's hair in the 18th century followed its own set of rules. The wig, which dominates the visual image of the 1700s man in the popular imagination, was actually primarily a feature of the earlier part of the century and of certain specific social contexts. By the mid-1700s, wigs were declining in fashionable wear, though they persisted in formal and professional settings, particularly in law and in certain ranks of the military, well into the century. Many men of the middle class and above kept their own hair and either powdered it or styled it back and tied it with a ribbon, the style that appears in most portraits of founding-era Americans. The management of men's hair was, practically speaking, somewhat simpler than women's, partly because shorter or tied-back styles required less daily maintenance, and partly because men generally operated in the public world in ways that made certain kinds of grooming attention both more visible and more expected. A tradesman or a lawyer who appeared with his hair disordered was communicating something about himself, and he knew it. Shaving, for men who shaved, was a daily or near-daily ritual accomplished with a straight razor, a strop to keep the edge maintained, and whatever soap or fat was at hand to soften the beard. This was skilled work. A bad shave with a straight razor produced cuts, and cuts in an era without antibiotics could become infected, and infections could become serious. Men who could afford it used a barber. Men who could not learn to do it themselves or had a member of their household do it for them. The barber, in the 18th century, occupied a role considerably more central to daily life than the modern barbershop suggests. He was a source of shaving services, certainly, but also of news, of social connection, of the particular kind of conversation that happens in a space where men gather regularly for a predictable, moderately intimate service. The barber's shop in a colonial town was a social institution, and the man who ran it was often a well-connected figure in the community, privy to an enormous amount of information simply by virtue of who sat in his chair. Let us talk now about something that most histories of this period managed to avoid entirely, and which I think deserves careful, honest attention. The smell of a colonial town, not the smell of an individual person, which we have been discussing and which was managed in the ways I have described, but the ambient smell of the environment those people moved through every day. Modern noses, if transported to a colonial American town of any size, would encounter something quite different from anything in our experience. Not universally terrible, not a constant assault, but different in ways that would register immediately. The animals were everywhere. In the 18th century, animals were not confined to farms outside of town. They moved through town. Pigs were regularly seen in the streets of colonial cities, performing a kind of garbage management function, eating the organic waste that was discarded. Horses were the primary mode of transport, and a city with significant horse traffic produced significant horse manure in the streets constantly. Cattle were driven through town to slaughter. Chickens lived in backyards. The smell of animals, their bodies and their waste, was the background note of urban life. Tanneries, essential establishments in any town of any size, because leather was a fundamental material of the era for shoes and harnesses and a dozen other necessities, required a process that involved soaking hides in urine and various other biological materials. Tanneries were odoriferous in the extreme, and they were a fixture of every colonial town. Regulations requiring them to be placed at the edges of settlements, away from the centers of social life, existed precisely because the smell was recognized as a problem, though the idea that the smell was actually a health risk in the modern sense was not well understood. The privies. Every household had one. Most towns had regulations, at least on paper, about where they could be placed, how far from wells, how they should be managed. The actual compliance with these regulations varied widely. The relationship between human waste disposal and drinking water quality was understood in a general intuitive sense, meaning people knew that having a privy very close to a well was a bad idea, without understanding the mechanism of why. The science of waterborne illness was still well over a century away from being understood. Middens, the household refuse pits where everything that could not be composted, burned, or fed to animals was discarded, occupied spaces near homes and contributed their own layer to the ambient atmosphere. The river. In every colonial city situated on a river, the river received everything: wastewater, industrial runoff from the mills and the tanneries, the overflow from privies, the discharge from slaughterhouses. The river was the infrastructure of waste management in an era before sewers. Its own capacity for self-cleaning was real but not infinite, and in hot weather in a city of any density, the river near the populated areas did not smell like something you wanted to stand near. And yet, within all of this, people lived, they adapted. The nose is remarkable in its capacity for habituation, and a nose that grew up in a colonial town never registered its ambient environment as offensive the way a modern nose arriving from outside would. The smell of horses was simply the smell of the street, no more remarkable than the smell of car exhaust is to us, present, unavoidable, essentially unnoticed. There is a famous observation attributed to various figures of the period, though pinning it to a specific source is difficult, that the poor did not notice the smell of poverty because they had always lived in it. The inverse is equally true. The smell of prosperity was not particularly pleasant either, in its way, and no one who lived inside it thought much about it. This is not a defense of poor sanitation. The connection between the environmental conditions I have been describing and the disease burden of the 18th century was real and significant. Typhoid, dysentery, and a range of waterborne and foodborne illnesses moved through colonial populations with a frequency and severity that modern public health has almost entirely eliminated in wealthy countries at enormous cost in infrastructure and institutional effort. The men and women who eventually mapped the pathways of disease transmission and built the systems that interrupted those pathways were doing some of the most consequential public health work in human history. But understanding the relationship between the 18th century and its environment requires resisting the temptation to flatten everything into a single judgment. It was not uniformly disgusting. It was not comparable to modern conditions in any straightforward way. It was specific, textured, variable by place and class and season, and navigated by people who had developed a set of practices and intuitions and habits that, within their own framework, made considerable sense. Let us go back inside now, back to the kitchen, back to the basin on the shelf. After her morning wash, after the fire is built up, and the porridge is ready, and the children have been roused, and the morning's first round of chores is underway, she begins to think about the laundry. Not today, probably, tomorrow, or the day after. The weather matters. This is February, which means cold, which means anything washed outside will freeze before it dries, if she is not careful about timing and placement. She needs a good drying day, which in February means watching the sky for something clear and not too windy. The laundry. This is the single most labor-intensive domestic task of the 18th century, and I want to spend real time with it because it shaped the entire rhythm of the week and the month and the body of work that a woman in this era was responsible for managing. In historical surveys of household labor in the colonial period, laundry consistently appears as the task women describe with the most physical exhaustion and the most specific dread. Cooking was daily, constant, ever-present, but it was also something that produced a result you could smell and taste and feel good about. Laundry was a different kind of ordeal. The washing day, because laundry was not a daily task but a periodic event, a whole day consumed by a single process, began early, very early, before dawn, sometimes, because the water needed to be heating before the work could properly begin. Water, again, water. Everything comes back to water. The volume of water required to do the family laundry was substantial, not 10 gallons or 20 gallons, more. A family of any size, washing the shirts and shifts and petticoats and stockings and caps and tablecloths and bed linen that accumulated over a week or two, needed water measured in barrels, heated over the fire in the largest pots the household possessed. The soap was often homemade. Lye soap, produced from wood ash, was the standard cleaner of the colonial household. Lye is a strong alkali made by pouring water through hardwood ashes and collecting the liquid that came through, and when combined with rendered fat, it saponified into a coarse but effective soap. Making lye soap was itself a periodic domestic production, separate from washing day but connected to it, and it required its own specific knowledge and attention. Too weak a lye, and the soap did not clean properly. Too strong, and it damaged the fabric. Getting it right was a skill, and it was a skill that was taught and passed on. The actual process of washing involved beating or scrubbing the linen against a washboard or a flat stone, working the soapy water through the fabric repeatedly, rinsing in clean water, wringing by hand until the fabric was as dry as hand strength could make it, and then hanging or laying it to dry. In summer, drying was straightforward. Fence rails, bushes, the low branches of trees, the grass itself on a good drying day, all of these became temporary drying infrastructure. In winter, drying happened indoors, with the fabric hung near the fire, which meant the main living space of the house smelled of damp linen and wood smoke for however many days the drying took. This was not a pleasant smell exactly, but it was a familiar one, and the specific texture of that smell in a warm room in winter is one of those sensory memories that, when you reconstruct it from enough different historical sources, becomes weirdly vivid and almost recognizable. The wringing was hard on the hands. This is a small thing to mention, but I keep coming back to it, because the physical evidence of what this work did to women's hands shows up in a surprising number of historical sources, not as complaint exactly, but as fact. Cold water and repeated immersion roughened the skin. Lye soap was caustic and dried the skin further. Women's hands in this period, particularly the hands of women doing their own laundry, were red, chapped, sometimes cracked. They bled in winter, when the cold made the cracking worse. There were remedies. Tallow rubbed into the hands before bed, or after each washing session, to try to restore some of the moisture lost. Goose grease, rendered mutton fat, whatever was at hand and could be spared, these helped, imperfectly. They helped enough that the practice persisted and was passed on. The chapped hands of a working woman were themselves a kind of legibility, a physical record of her labor that anyone who shook her hand or glanced at her in the course of a day could read. And here is where the class dimension enters again. The smooth hands of a woman who did not do her own laundry signaled something immediately, not virtue, not necessarily worth, but status. The absence of laundry rough skin was as much a social signal as the presence of fine fabric or well-kept hair. Ironing, if you want to call it that, came after drying. The flat iron of the 18th century was exactly what the name suggests, a flat piece of iron with a handle, heated directly in or beside the fire, and then applied to fabric. There were no temperature settings. There was the heat of the fire and the judgment of the person holding the iron, which was developed over years of practice. An iron that was too hot scorched the linen, and scorched linen was a ruin and a waste. An iron that was too cool did not smooth the fabric and required repeated passes that extended the work. The test for correct temperature was to hold the iron near the face, feeling the heat radiating from it, or to touch a dampened finger briefly to the sole and listen for the hiss, or simply to make a test pass on a piece you could afford to ruin slightly. Each woman had her method, learnt from whoever taught her. The finished laundry, clean and smoothed and neatly folded, was an accomplishment in the most literal sense of the word. Something had been accomplished. The body of work had a result you could hold in your hands, stack on a shelf, distribute back through the household. There is a reason that laundry, in a period before washing machines, carried a kind of significance that it no longer has. Now let me take you somewhere different, somewhere I have been wanting to take you for the last several pages. A city, Philadelphia, 1765. Philadelphia by the mid-18th century was one of the most cosmopolitan cities in British North America, with a population approaching 30,000 people, a busy port, a thriving merchant class, multiple newspapers, a college, a hospital, a learned society. It was a place where ideas moved quickly, and where the gap between the very rich and the very poor was visible in almost every street. Walking through Philadelphia in 1765, you would encounter a range of personal hygiene practices that reflected that social range almost perfectly. In the wealthy neighborhoods near the center of town, behind the brick facades of the better houses, there were dressing rooms. Not rooms dedicated to the worship of clothes in the way we might think of a modern dressing room or walk-in closet, but functional spaces designed for the morning routine of people who had enough space and enough resources to give that routine its own room. A dressing table with a mirror, the best mirror the household could afford, often framed in walnut or mahogany. A washstand, a small piece of furniture designed specifically to hold the basin and pitcher, sometimes with a small shelf for the essentials of personal care. A chamber pot tucked discreetly under or behind something. A proper towel, meaning a piece of linen or sometimes even cotton, that was reserved for face drying and kept separate from the kitchen cloths. The wealthy woman of the house had a more elaborate version of the morning routine we watched in Connecticut. More time for it, more space for it, more objects to do it with, and often a servant to assist with the parts that required assistance. The lacing, the hair, the buttons at the back of the dress that a woman could not easily reach herself. The personal hygiene of the wealthy in this era also included practices that their less wealthy contemporaries could not access. Tooth powder made of finer materials, sometimes imported from London, where there was already a small market in branded personal care products. Perfumed water for the face, scented with lavender or orange flower, available from apothecaries at prices that made them luxuries. Pumice stones for smoothing rough skin on feet and elbows, small brushes for eyebrows or for the hairline. Not all of this was purely aesthetic. Some of it was actually protective in practical ways. The lavender water and the other floral waters used on the skin and in the hair had mildly antimicrobial properties, not strong enough to make a significant clinical difference in most circumstances, but not nothing either. The practice of using strongly scented substances as part of personal hygiene was ancient, and some of its persistence into the 18th century and beyond was genuinely connected to a folk understanding, unscientific in its framing but not entirely wrong in its intuition, that pleasant smells and certain plants had purifying properties. The miasma theory of disease, which held that illness was caused by bad air arising from rotting matter and putrefaction, was still the dominant framework for understanding sickness in 1765. It was wrong about the mechanism, as we now know, but it produced a particular kind of attention to smell. If bad smells meant disease, then the presence of pleasant smells was at least symbolically, and in some cases practically, protective. The herbs and flowers used in personal care, the lavender sachets placed in linen chests, the rosemary hung in rooms, all operated within this framework, and some of them, incidentally, did have properties that modern research has confirmed as genuinely useful. In the poorer neighborhoods of Philadelphia, in the alleys and courts behind the main streets where housing was crowded and water access was limited and privies were shared among multiple families, the morning routine was compressed to almost nothing. A basin if there was one, a cloth if there was a clean one, water carried from a shared pump or purchased from a water carrier who moved through the streets selling it by the bucket. The water carriers of colonial Philadelphia were a recognized trade, men and later women who transported water from pumps and wells to households that did not have easy access to a water source of their own. The cost of purchased water was small by most standards, but not insignificant to the very poor, and it meant that water was used carefully and used for multiple purposes before being discarded. Skin conditions were common in this population, partly from the cold and the manual labor and the chapping I described earlier, but also from the proximity in which people lived and the difficulty of maintaining the cleanliness practices that would have interrupted transmission. Scabies, caused by a tiny mite that burrows under the skin and produces intense itching, moved through crowded housing with some regularity. Ringworm, a fungal infection despite its misleading name, was present. Lice, as we have touched on, were a persistent reality across all classes but particularly persistent in conditions of crowding and limited access to hot water and fine-toothed combs. The treatment for lice in the 18th century involved a combination of the fine-toothed comb, which remains effective today, and various topical applications, olive oil or butter applied to the hair and left for a period to smother the lice, then combed through carefully. Strong herbal preparations, vinegar rinses, applications of kerosene in later years, though that brings its own set of problems. The treatments worked to varying degrees. The fine-toothed comb remains the gold standard even today, having not been improved upon in any essential way in the 3,000 years since its invention. I want to step back from Philadelphia for a moment and think about something larger, because I think it illuminates why the history of hygiene matters in ways beyond the simply interesting. The practices I have been describing, the partial washing, the linen management, the periodic bathing, the hair care, the soap and the comb and the cloth, these were not arbitrary customs. They were adaptive responses to the actual circumstances of life in the 18th century. They worked, within the constraints of those circumstances, to manage the most significant health risks in ways that the people using them could sustain given their resources. When those circumstances changed, when industrialization brought cheap soap and eventually clean piped water, and eventually the germ theory of disease, the practices changed. Not all at once, not uniformly, not without resistance and inertia and the stubbornness of habit, but they changed. And they changed in the direction of better health outcomes in most cases, because the new understanding and the new infrastructure were genuinely improvements. But the old practices were not irrational. They were the best available responses to a set of conditions that no longer exist, and understanding them as rational adaptations rather than as backward superstitions changes how you see the people who used them. There is also this: the new practices that replaced the old ones also came with their own costs and their own new problems, some of which we are still working through. The mass production of cheap soap in the 19th century improved public health and also introduced synthetic chemical compounds into daily body care routines at a scale that had never existed before. The chlorination of water supplies reduced waterborne illness dramatically and also introduced a disinfectant compound into drinking water, whose long-term effects are still debated. The modern personal care industry, which generates hundreds of billions of dollars annually and touches the body of virtually every person in the developed world every day, is largely unregulated in terms of the ingredients it uses and carries its own set of risks and uncertainties that we do not fully understand yet. None of this makes the old ways better. The mortality statistics of the 18th century are not something anyone should romanticize, but it invites a certain humility about our own certainties, a recognition that each era makes the best adaptations it can with the knowledge and resources available, and that our era's certainties will look to whoever comes after us with the perspective of time like a mixture of genuine wisdom and things we could not see clearly because we were inside them. Let us go back to the farmhouse in Connecticut, back to that woman. It is afternoon now. The porridge was eaten, the fire was tended, the first round of morning chores is done. She is at the hearth again, stirring something. Her hands hurt. They hurt every winter, the cracking and the cold, and she has learnt to notice it less than she used to. There is a small pot of tallow near the fire, and at the end of the day, when the worst of the work is done, she will rub some of it into her hands before she sleeps. She has done this every winter of her adult life. Her mother did it before her. She does not think of it as self-care. She does not think of it as a practice or a ritual or a routine. It is simply what you do when your hands are cracked and cold and there is tallow near the fire. It helps. So you do it. This is the texture of hygiene in the 18th century. Practical, adaptive, carried in the body's own memory more than in any written guide, passed from mother to daughter and woman to woman through demonstration and habit, and the accumulated wisdom of generations doing the same small things in the same small ways, and finding that they worked. There was a whole lexicon of this knowledge, most of it never written down. Which herbs made a good rinse for the hair, which wood ash produced the best lye for soap, how to tell when the iron was hot enough without burning the linen, how to treat a cracked heel with rendered fat and a cloth wrapped overnight, how to manage a child with head lice quickly and without too much distress, how to keep the bed linens from developing the worst of the mite populations by airing them frequently on cold, sunny days, a practice that modern allergy specialists would enthusiastically endorse. None of this knowledge required a medical degree. None of it was taught in any school. All of it required attention, care, and the specific intelligence of someone who had spent years watching what happened when things were done well and when they were not. I want to talk about the smell of clean for a moment, because I think it is one of the places where the 18th century and our own era diverge in ways that are genuinely interesting to think about. Clean, in the modern world, has a smell. It is synthetic. It is lavender or linen or fresh cotton, or a specific combination of synthetic fragrance compounds that personal care companies have associated with cleanliness through decades of marketing. The clean smell of modern laundry detergent, the clean smell of shampoo, the clean smell of a recently showered body, these are manufactured smells. They are real in the sense that they produce real olfactory experience, but the specific molecules creating them did not exist in nature before the industrial chemistry of the 19th and 20th centuries produced them. Clean in the 18th century smelled like something else. It smelled like sun and air when the laundry came in from drying outside on a clear day. It smelled faintly of the herbs used in the final rinse, rosemary or lavender or mint. It smelled like beeswax when furniture was polished and the linen was stored in a press with sachets of herbs. It smelled like the wood smoke that permeated everything in any house with a working hearth, a smell that is not what we would call clean today, but that was simply the background note of domestic life and not associated with uncleanliness. The body of a well-managed person in 1743 smelled like the world around them: wood smoke, fresh air, the herbs they used, the clean linen they wore, not like the synthetic neutrality we associate with cleanliness today, but not like uncleanliness either, like a person, a real person, existing in a real world, smelling of what that world was made of. There is something almost disorienting about this, when you let yourself fully imagine it. We have so thoroughly replaced the actual smell of clean bodies and clean fabric and clean spaces with synthetic substitutes that the original has become strange, almost threatening in its realness. But the people of 1743 were not confused about cleanliness. They had clear standards. They enforced them socially. They worked hard to maintain them. They just did it with different tools and different substances and different assumptions about what the body needed and how often it needed water. Let me take you somewhere new before we close this part of the story. A room in London, 1758, a rented set of rooms in a building just off one of the streets leading down to the Thames, occupied by a young man who has recently come from the provinces to try his luck in the city. He is not wealthy. He has some education and some ambition, and very little money, and the particular kind of courage that young people arriving in cities for the first time always seem to carry. His morning routine takes less time than hers in Connecticut, partly because he has fewer obligations, and partly because his version of acceptable morning presentation is simpler. He washes his face, he runs a comb through his hair and retties it, he checks his coat for any visible marks, and brushes one away with his sleeve. He is at his desk and at work within 20 minutes of waking, which is more or less what is expected of him. But once a week, on Saturdays, he goes to the public baths. The public baths of 18th century London are one of those institutions that have almost entirely vanished from the historical record in the popular imagination, partly because they were superseded so completely by private bathing facilities that became common in the 19th century, and partly because they do not fit neatly into either the narrative of the unwashed past or the narrative of progressive improvement. They existed, they were used, they served a significant portion of the urban population that did not have the space or resources for private bathing. The 18th century public bath was not what you might imagine from the phrase. It was not the grand Roman bath of antiquity or the Victorian municipal swimming bath that would come later. It was usually a modest commercial establishment, sometimes attached to a barber's shop, offering a private or semi-private room with a tub, hot water, and the use of a towel for a fee that varied by the quality of the establishment. The simplest were cheap enough that even relatively poor workers could afford them occasionally. The better ones offered more comfort and a more elaborate experience. Our young man in his London rooms goes because the alternative, heating enough water in his small rented space to do anything useful, is impractical. The baths solve the problem. For the price of a few pence he gets hot water, a tub, 20 minutes or half an hour of private time, and the particular satisfaction of starting the week with a body that has been thoroughly washed. He does not think of this as remarkable. It is simply one of the things he does on Saturdays. But the infrastructure supporting it, the institution of the public bath as a feature of urban life, is doing something important that we rarely credit it with. It is providing access to a standard of personal hygiene to people who could not otherwise achieve it in their cramped urban circumstances. Public baths of various kinds existed throughout the 18th century in most European cities of any size, and in the American colonial cities as well, though less formally. The combination of the barbershop, the bathhouse, and the tavern in certain parts of colonial towns created informal networks of hygiene-adjacent social life that served the needs of people who lived in conditions that made private bathing impractical. The private bath, the bathroom in the house, as a standard feature of domestic architecture, came later, much later than most people realize. In Britain, the plumbed bathroom did not become a standard feature of even middle-class housing until the latter half of the 19th century. In the American cities, similar timelines applied. The farmhouse in Connecticut would not have a fixed bathroom with running water until the 20th century, and in rural areas, the transition came even later than that. This means that the entire history of daily body management that we have been exploring, the basin, the cloth, the periodic full bath, the public facilities, the careful management of linen, was not some primitive practice that people put up with before the real solution arrived. It was the dominant practice for virtually every human being on Earth for the entire span of human civilization up until about 150 years ago. The technological infrastructure we use to manage our bodies now, the piped water, the indoor plumbing, the hot and cold taps, the shower, the daily bath, is extraordinarily new in the context of human history. We have had it for a blink. This does not mean we should give it up. The improvements in health outcomes that came with clean piped water and improved sanitation are real and enormous and worth defending fiercely. But knowing how recently we acquired them, knowing that everything before them was not a failure but a set of adaptive practices that people developed and refined over centuries, changes the quality of the attention you bring to those older practices. They deserve to be understood on their own terms. The Connecticut woman, finishing her day at the hearth with the tallow worked into her cracked hands, was not waiting for someone to rescue her from the past. She was living fully and competently in her own present. The tools she used were the right tools for her circumstances. The knowledge she carried was real and earned and passed on. The cleanliness she maintained was, within its own framework, genuine. There is one more room I want to visit before we close tonight, a sick room. Because hygiene and medicine in the 18th century were not cleanly separated the way they tend to be in our mental models, the management of illness happened in the domestic space, under the care of the women of the household, with the same tools and substances and practical knowledge that governed daily hygiene, and the line between maintaining health and treating illness was blurred in ways that produced both some genuine wisdom and some genuine danger. The sick room in a colonial household was the main room of the house, or if the house was large enough, a separate bedroom. When someone was seriously ill, the household reorganized around that illness. The fire was kept burning higher, the room was kept dark, fresh water was brought regularly. The person was given broth and herbal preparations, and whatever the collective household knowledge suggested might help. Herbal medicine in the 18th century was not a fringe practice. It was the primary medicine for the vast majority of people who could not afford or could not access a physician. The household herb garden was a functional medical pharmacy, and the woman who tended it knew what it could and could not do. Certain herbs had genuine clinical efficacy, as modern pharmacology has confirmed. Willow bark, containing the compound from which aspirin was eventually synthesized, was used as a fever reducer and pain reliever, and it worked. Garlic, applied topically or consumed, has genuine antimicrobial properties. Yarrow was used to slow bleeding, and again has been confirmed to have properties that support this use. Peppermint for digestive complaints, lavender for headache, chamomile for sleep and anxiety, elderflower for fever reduction. The list is long, and while not everything on it holds up to modern scrutiny, a significant portion of it does. Alongside these genuine tools, there were practices that ranged from harmless to actively harmful. The use of tobacco as a topical antiseptic and wound treatment was common and probably did some good. The internal use of mercury compounds, still in wide circulation in the 18th century as treatments for various illnesses including syphilis, was catastrophically bad for health in ways that were not understood at the time but that are written in the skeletal records of the era. Bloodletting, still practiced by physicians though declining in this century, removed the one thing a sick person least needed to lose. The management of fever is where I find the period's practices most interesting, because the approaches used were a mixture of wisdom and error in roughly equal measure. Fever in the 18th century was understood as a symptom to be treated directly, which meant trying to reduce it through various means. Cool water applied to the forehead and the wrists and the inner thighs. The patient stripped of excess coverings in warm weather to allow heat to dissipate. Willow bark tea administered to bring the fever down. These practices, considered together, are roughly what a modern emergency medicine practitioner would recommend for management of moderate fever in a patient not requiring immediate hospitalization. But fever was also treated, in some traditions and in some circumstances, by the opposite approach: piling on blankets, keeping the room very hot, encouraging sweating on the theory that sweating the fever out was purifying. This approach, if it worked at all, worked by forcing the body to cool itself through the sweating mechanism, but it also risked dangerous dehydration, particularly in children, and the conditions of the very hot, airless sick room it required were themselves not conducive to recovery. The people managing these sick rooms were not incompetent. They were working with the best knowledge they had. They watched carefully. They adjusted. When something seemed to make a patient worse, they generally stopped doing it, at least eventually. The accumulation of this kind of observational learning across generations produced a body of practical knowledge that was imperfect and partial, but was also genuinely useful. The most consistent thread through all of it, the thing that appears over and over again in the household guides and the recipe books and the letter advice of 18th century women managing illness in their households, is the emphasis on cleanliness in the sick environment, fresh air, clean linen, fresh water, regular attention to the patient's physical state, not the mechanism of why these things mattered, because the mechanism was not yet understood, but the practice of doing them, reliable and persistent, because they seemed to help, and everyone who had cared for the sick for long enough knew that they did. Florence Nightingale, working in the Crimean War over 100 years after the period we have been discussing, did not discover that clean environments helped patients recover. She demonstrated it statistically, at a scale that changed medical practice, yes, but the knowledge that cleanliness helped the sick was older than her by centuries. It lived in the households, in the hands of women who had been managing illness without formal training for as long as people had been getting ill. That knowledge was not valued, it was not counted, it was not credited, it was simply done in the daily and nightly labor of the households where it lived. And then the credit for the principle it expressed went to someone else, later, when the tools for making it legible to the people who controlled institutions finally existed. There is something to sit with there, in the quiet. The afternoon is going now, in whatever season finds you, in whatever part of the world you are in. If you have been following this story from the beginning, you have come a long way with me. From the farmhouse kitchen at dawn to the Philadelphia street, from the London bathhouse to the sick room, from the cracked hands and the tallow to the herbal garden and the fine-toothed comb. What I want to leave you with is not a lesson exactly. The best histories are not lessons. They are windows, and what you do with what you see through them is yours to decide. But I have found, sitting with this material over the weeks it took me to put this together, that it does something specific to my sense of the present. It makes the daily acts of managing the body feel less automatic, less trivial, more continuous, with a very long line of people doing similar things with very different tools in very different conditions, all of them trying to navigate the same fundamental challenge. How do you live in a body, in the world, in the company of other people, and keep yourself well enough to keep going? The 18th century woman with her basin and her cloth and her twice-weekly tallow routine and her once-monthly hair wash and her careful management of the linen was engaged in the same project you are. The tools have changed almost beyond recognition. The project has not. There is a generosity, I think, in recognizing this, a generosity toward the past, which did not have our tools, but was not for that reason less thoughtful or less caring, and maybe a corresponding generosity toward ourselves, in the present, when the tools we have make the project feel like it should be easier than it is, simpler than it is, more manageable than it turns out to be, despite everything. The body is still the body. It still needs water and attention and rest and care. It still makes demands that do not respect the schedule or the season or the available resources. It still, somehow, after everything keeps going. That woman in Connecticut, finishing her day, her hands smelling of tallow and wood smoke and the cold water of the basin and the faint green of the herbs drying near the hearth, she knew this not because she had learnt it, but because she had never unlearned it, and learning it again, piece by piece, habit by habit, the particular quality of warm water on cold hands, the specific weight of clean linen, the smell of something simmering that means someone remembered and someone cared and someone will be fed, is the real work. Not dramatic, not fast, not likely to produce the transformation promised by any product or program or optimization protocol. Just the patient, ordinary, extraordinary work of returning to the rhythms the human body was made for. The afternoon light is going now, in whatever season you are reading this, in whatever corner of the world you are in. Somewhere, in some kitchen, something is simmering on a back burner. The smell of it is the smell of time and care, and there is a woman who put it there and will go back to check on it in a while, and she will serve it at the table when it is ready, and someone will sit down across from her and eat. The dishes will need washing afterward. The kitchen will need putting right. Tomorrow the whole thing begins again. This is not a small thing. It never was. Come back when you need to. Sleepy old world will be here,